Chapter 288. Seeing how Fang Xinjian seemed to be very logical and very serious, Ada thought to herself as she trained the students. Like female knights like Rhoda, Ada had also grown up in an aristocratic family. She had received the best education and top-notch cultivation resources. In addition to her outstanding talent and willingness to work hard in her cultivation, she had been able to become a level 24 conferred knight. Despite this, she was already 38 years old this year. She had gotten married when she was 28 years old. It was a pity that her husband had attempted to attain the heavenly barrier of 30% ether particles when she was 30 years old. He failed and became a vegetable. This was the worst situation. Because becoming a vegetable was not a true death, both families did not allow Ada to get a divorce and get married in order to maintain their reputations and honor, making her a living widow. Ada continued to blame herself and put all her energy into cultivation. However, her mood continued to worsen, and her temper also became increasingly irritable. She would flare up at the slightest provocation and became an old woman that no one in the entire academy was willing to pay any attention to. Harsh, strict, and bad-tempered, this became everyone's impression of her. This continued until 2 years ago, when she had been hunting ferocious beasts in the wild and had met the fifth prince. This time around, she had been completely convinced by the fifth prince's demeanor, talent, and abilities. In her eyes, there was no other man in the world who could be compared to the fifth prince. Thinking of the fifth prince, Ada unknowingly broke into a smile, and her gaze toward Fang Xinjian became even colder. It just so happens that the fifth prince's fist theories are connected to sword theories. After reading through the aquatic sword formation and observing the heavenly waterfall lake, he imparted me the heavenly waterfall / Even if you're wearing the level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor, you won't be able to fend off this move created by the fifth prince. I'll use this move to defeat you so that you'll know that there's always someone better out there. Fang Xinjian continued to eat and cultivate. About 1.5 hours later, he opened up his 5 fingers, as if he could feel a gush of water vapor gushing toward him. In the blink of an eye, countless water droplets continued to gather above his palm, forming a long sword made of water. Rhoda smiled and asked, "You've mastered the aquatic sword formation?" Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "This is only the aquatic sword cheese. You'll need to set up at least 12 aquatic sword cheese in order to condense a sword formation." Therefore, under the astonished gazes of the 2 students, Rhoda, Ada, and the others, Fang Xinjian condensed stream after stream of aquatic sword cheese in his hands. After each stream appeared, he would toss it into midair. In the blink of an eye, 12 streams of aquatic sword cheese had appeared. The moment the 12 streams of sword cheese appeared, a mysterious connection was born between them. Fang Xinjian seemed to have become the control center of a transit station, continuously exchanging information and energy with the 12 streams of sword cheese through ether particles. The corners of Fang Xinjian's lips curled up into a hint of a confident smile. He tapped out lightly with his sword fingers, and 12 streams of sword cheese circled around his body, dancing about like floating forts. He laughed out loud, casually took out a stream of aquatic sword chi, and danced with it. The water sword in his hand swung about freely, and the remaining 11 streams of sword cheese around him moved about, slicing through the air and releasing poochie-poochie sounds. Fang Xinjian tapped his long sword across space, and the 11 streams of sword cheese shot out consecutively. As the streams of sword cheese moved about, they lifted up several 10,000 jin of sand on the shore. Even Rhoda and the others could sense that the aquatic sword cheese were circulating at high speed, containing an unparalleled slashing force. Regardless of what rocks or sand they encountered, they would all slash through. They were extremely sharp, just like high-speed water blades. Wherever the aquatic sword cheese passed by, there would be a sense of dryness gushing forth. This was the result of the aquatic sword cheese ceaselessly absorbing water vapor to replenish the depletion from slashing. Once the aquatic sword cheese were formed, the 12 streams of sword cheese, including the one in Fang Xinjian's hand, would continue to absorb the water vapor in the world. Moreover, they would replenish each other at any time. The aquatic sword cheese that were formed circled around Fang Xinjian like they were his arms, hitting wherever he pointed. The air whistled, and as the sword cheese moved about, more and more water vapor continued to gather in Fang Xinjian's direction. Stream after stream of aquatic sword cheese were continuously condensed by him, and the large amount of water vapor gathering made it seem as if a heavy rain had fallen on the heavenly waterfall lake. A large amount of water vapor gathered together, forming water droplets that eventually gushed into Fang Xinjian's palm, condensing stream after stream of aquatic sword cheese. The aquatic sword formation could be considered to be at level 1 by condensing 12 streams of aquatic sword cheese. From then on, it would continue to grow, and at level 5, it would be able to condense 121 streams of aquatic sword cheese. At level 10, it would be able to condense 277 streams of aquatic sword cheese. Right now, Fang Xinjian had already condensed 49 streams of aquatic sword cheese, reaching level 4 of the aquatic sword cheese. He was now able to further control the water vapor. The sword cheese in his hand swept out, and the remaining 48 streams of aquatic sword cheese swept out in all directions. They were like exploding fireworks, vaguely taking up an area with a radius of 100 meters around him. Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "You've finally achieved something." He turned to look at Ada and said, "Please give me some guidance on the aquatic sword formation." Ada stood in the middle of the heavenly waterfall lake. The heavenly waterfall in the sky came crashing down, but it was as if it had been slashed apart by invisible sharp blades above her head. The water was unable to touch her body at all. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, she laughed coldly and said, "You want me to give you guidance with just a level 4 aquatic sword technique? We'll talk after you enter the heavenly waterfall lake." Fang Xinjian smiled faintly and was already taking one step at a time, heading in the direction of the heavenly waterfall lake. The 48 streams of aquatic sword cheese around him were like floating cannons, turning into many mysterious trajectories and circling around his body. They also looked like countless satellites. The way this sword formation operated could be said to have both offense and defense. It could be used to attack or defend in any direction at any time. Fang Xinjian walked into the heavenly waterfall lake and slowly submerged his entire body into the water. The aquatic sword cheese also merged into the water. The aquatic sword cheese were condensed from water vapor to begin with, and now that they entered the water, they were like fish in water, becoming more than 10 times more agile. However, at the same time, Fang Xinjian could also sense that the omnipresent undercurrents and waves in the lake were like streams of water-shaped shock waves smashing out toward his body. The power of water was very strong. The undercurrents in the sea could knock people unconscious, drag them deep into the sea, or even shock them to death. The power of tsunamis could drown cities, killing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. The heavenly waterfall lake had been created by the second-generation governor back then. The various undercurrents and waves in the lake were all circulating according to the aquatic sword formation's ingenuity. The omnipresent shock waves were like endless sword waves, smashing out toward Fang Xinjian. Seeing how Fang Xinjian was swaying from the blows, the corners of Ada's lips curled up, revealing a hint of a disdainful smile. At the same time that Fang Xinjian was being hit, he sensed the circulation of the aquatic sword formation in the lake. He had been relying on his level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor to intentionally get hit so that his body could experience the profoundness of the sword formation. Chapter 289. Even though Fang Xinjian had relaxed his body, there were still shock waves formed from streams of water that continued to hit his body. Sensing the waves of sword forces hitting his body, Fang Xinjian continued to experience the profoundness of the aquatic sword formation. At the next moment, his entire body trembled, and he put his fingers together like swords. The streams of aquatic sword cheese that had already merged into the lake water started to roar together. They were like streams of water dragons, swimming around and clashing against the shock waves that were attacking Fang Xinjian. They continued to deplete each other's power. Fang Xinjian was controlling his aquatic sword formation to go up against the Heavenly Waterfall Lake's aquatic sword formation. However, the entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake was like a huge millstone. The vortex at the bottom of the lake in the middle, together with the waterfalls descending from the sky, seemed as if they were going to crush everything in the lake water into dust. This was equivalent to using the powers of the world to attack the opponent. Meanwhile, Fang Xinjian was controlling his aquatic sword formation, relying on his own power to go up against the powers of the world. Streams of water waves continued to be destroyed, and the aquatic sword cheese that he had condensed were also being depleted. In the blink of an eye, more and more shock waves struck his body, exploding into large amounts of water. The aquatic sword formation that Fang Xinjian was controlling started to shake. However, at the same time, as it continued to go up against the powers of the entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake, Fang Xinjian continued to sense and comprehend the profoundness of the entire sword formation. The speed at which he was controlling the aquatic sword formation was also increasing. In the scene that his consciousness had constructed, the shock waves formed from the lake water were very obvious. The trajectories that they passed by shone brightly in his mind, and the countless trajectories continued to stack up, change, and surge, forming the shape of the entire formation. Just like that, Fang Xinjian suddenly started to slowly move towards the center of the lake. The entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake was formed from the Heavenly Waterfall and the underground vortex. The closer he got to the center, the stronger the power of the formation. This was especially so in the center, where the speed of the water currents was over several meters per second. Moreover, these rapid currents were clashing, spinning, and slicing each other. Even if steel were to fall in, it would be instantly torn into pieces. And the closer Fang Xinjian got to the center of the lake, the greater the pressure he felt. In the center of the lake, there was not a single drop of water within 5 meters around Ada. It was as if there was an air bubble surrounding her. All the water currents seemed to have become docile kittens when they reached her. Behind her, the female knight who was only wearing a swimsuit exclaimed, "How amazing! To think that he has started to comprehend the profoundness of the sword formation in such a short period. This guy's talent is really terrifying. He might really be able to enter the center of the Heavenly Waterfall Lake." Ada shook her head and said, "Humph, the Heavenly Waterfall Lake isn't something that can be broken through so easily. The closer one is to the center of the lake, the greater the pressure one will face." Ada, heavens! The wave Fang Xinjian's Ada will. The waves of the pressure. XT of the sword of the sword. However, just as Ada said this, the sword force in Fang Xinjian's hand changed once again. Streams of shock waves clashed against his aquatic sword cheese. Not only were they unable to weaken the aquatic sword cheese, but they were instead gradually neutralized by the aquatic sword cheese. The speed at which the aquatic sword cheese were formed instantly doubled. They were actually able to withstand the surrounding shock waves and charged toward the center of the lake at an accelerated speed. What? Ada looked at this scene in astonishment. Back then, she had charged into the lake time and time again, going all out in her cultivation before she finally got used to the attacks in the lake. However, she had also spent half a year's time. And yet, Fang Xinjian had only spent over 10 minutes there. How long had it been? Yet he was already able to get used to the attacks from the sword formation? What kind of joke was this? It was a pity that Fang Xinjian was not joking around. Right now, countless light spots were flashing in his mind, and countless trajectories were circulating. All of them were the sword formation's changes and weaknesses. As he watched the sword formation circulate, he continued to control the aquatic sword cheese to move up and down, left and right, then absorb and redirect the incoming attack. Compared to attacking, the aquatic sword formation was actually a sword technique that excelled in defense. Surrounded by countless aquatic sword chis, it was enough to gradually buffer and absorb any attack. Fang Xinjian continued to absorb the attacks from the entire heavenly waterfall, charging toward the center of the lake. Seeing that Fang Xinjian was getting closer and closer, Ada's expression also turned solemn. It was an unprecedentedly solemn look. She had originally been a female knight with dreams, a future, and hope. However, after so many years, she had come to understand reality. Especially after meeting a genius amongst geniuses like the Fifth Prince, she had a deeper understanding that the talent of some people in this world was just so unreasonable. Even if ordinary people were to spend 10 or even 100 times more time, they might not even be able to comprehend as much as them. However, although she was astonished by Fang Xinjian's talent, she was even more confident in the Fifth Prince. His Highness is going to become the strongest man in the world. How can you possibly imagine how powerful and terrifying he is? Although it's true that Fang Xinjian is amazing, he's someone who only appears once every 100 years. In the future, he'll at most become Governor Devitt, or someone like one of the Empire's 10 great divine-level experts. And the Fifth Prince will become someone who will stand above the Mage Kings, the Pope, and the founding Emperor. He'll be in existence who can change history. Just as she was thinking of this, Ada's eyes were filled with confidence. She put her palms together, and streams of white cheese continued to condense in her hands. In the blink of an eye, they formed a stream of aquatic sword cheese. At the next moment, over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese appeared in the entire heavenly waterfall lake. The water of the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed to have frozen in that instant. How long had Ada been cultivating in the heavenly waterfall lake? Every day, she would gather sword cheese into the lake, and her understanding of the heavenly waterfall lake was unparalleled. The aquatic sword formation she performed almost encompassed the entire heavenly waterfall lake. With this activation, Ada's control over the heavenly waterfall lake reached a new limit. Meanwhile, Fang Xinjian felt as if the surrounding lake water had suddenly turned into cement, making each of his movements and sword moves 100 times more difficult than before. However, this was merely a warm-up for Ada. She did not plan on holding back against Fang Xinjian. She had just set up the aquatic sword formation when she once again activated her sword cheese, activating the powerful killing technique that the Fifth Prince had specially created for this location and her. The heavenly waterfall slashed. A loud rumble rang out. Under everyone's astonished gazes, the heavenly waterfall lake that was descending from the sky suddenly came to a standstill. At the next moment, the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed to have condensed into a stream of aquatic sword chi, piercing out fiercely toward Fang Xinjian with an extremely powerful impact. Chapter 290. The heavenly waterfall that came crashing down from the sky seemed to have gathered all the rainwater in an entire city and poured down together. How terrifying was the impact! The impact of the water could cause a huge explosion in the ground and then form a tsunami that was several meters tall. The water current would surge out at a speed of several thousand meters, tearing everything in its path into pieces. It was a lot more terrifying than ordinary air explosions because its mass and density were far above that of air. Sensing the heavenly waterfall longsword piercing toward him, Fang Xinjian's expression was extremely grim. Facing such an attack, even if he could use the power of terra ingurgitation to slash through it immediately, the heavenly waterfall seemed to be endless. Every time he slashed through a section, he would be engulfed by waves and waves of water. Moreover, he could only perform terra ingurgitation once an hour. Therefore, without any hesitation, Fang Xinjian used heaven's perception at the first instant and sent his consciousness into the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. Right now, he needed power. He needed the great power contained in this level 29 armor. Almost at the same instant he activated the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. Waves of overwhelming aura soared into the sky. The entire heavenly waterfall seemed to have a feeling of rising temperature. Of course, this was just an illusion. However, the remnant consciousness of a level 29 expert, just a subconscious willpower impact, still gave off a feeling as if the world was changing. Simultaneously, the entire Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor appeared on the surface of Fang Xinjian's body. Many dragon scale-like armor enveloped his body, moving along with the changes in his physical strength. The surface of the scales reflected streams of light that were like hints of flames. Streams of faint white light emerged from Fang Xinjian's arms, legs, and other parts of his body, forming many geometric figures. Many mysterious formation diagrams appeared behind Fang Xinjian's body. Acceleration force field, physical force field, automatic calibration force field, high-temperature resistance force field. Many force fields appeared as the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor was awakened. These force fields once again increased Fang Xinjian's destructive prowess. In void space, an endless amount of power gushed into Fang Xinjian's body. He felt as if his body had been inflated and was growing up. His power kept on increasing crazily, as if there were explosives exploding in his body. Roar! Like a boiling kettle, Fang Xinjian sensed the explosive power in his body. He opened his mouth and let out a long roar. Under the transformation of his sword bones, the air currents from his roar turned into a stream of sword chi that was over 100 meters long. It slashed down from the sky and slashed the incoming waterfall into two, splitting it in front of him. If it could be said that Ada's control of the heavenly waterfall to attack Fang Xinjian was like the heavenly river overturning and stirring up the Milky Way, then Fang Xinjian's shout was like the heavenly river overturning and splitting the Milky Way into two. This was the level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. This was a level 29 superior divine weapon set. It had finally displayed its most blatant violence to the world for the first time after its appearance. I'm not done yet. However, how could Ada possibly give up? She clenched her sword arts tightly with both hands, and the heavenly waterfall that had split into two was like two slithering snakes, once again dashing out toward Fang Xinjian from the left and right with an unparalleled impact. The atmosphere was trembling, the ground was trembling, and the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed as if it was boiling. The water gushed forth like a magnificent army, wanting to tear everything before them into dust. However, Fang Xinjian, who had activated the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, was not afraid at all. He punched out, and a stream of heavenly waterfall flowed in reverse. Amidst a series of explosions, sections of air and water mixed together and exploded, sent flying back into the sky by the sword force. Fang Xinjian stomped on the ground, and a faint white force field flashed under his feet. Then he charged out like a rocket. The world seemed to be stretched out at this moment, and the air was torn apart, forming a vacuum passageway. Before it could be filled up again by the surrounding air, Fang Xinjian had already punched out once again. An astonishing sword chi that was several hundred meters long shot out with a swoosh. Amidst a tearing sound that shook the area within a range of several thousand meters, the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky was pushed back. Fang Xinjian punched out after taking a few steps forward. The scales all over his body trembled crazily, and power gushed forth endlessly from void space, replenishing Fang Xinjian's depletion, strengthening his bones, muscles, vital energy, and blood. With each punch, there would be a white glow formed from the ether particles' force field, increasing the speed and strengthening layer by layer, amplifying Fang Xinjian's power. Streams and streams of astonishing sword chis continued to tear through the sky, pushing back the heavenly waterfall. They caused the heavenly waterfall to be unable to descend, and they continued to gather in the sky. At this moment, Fang Xinjian finally arrived at the center of the lake. Ada looked at Fang Xinjian and smiled coldly, thinking to herself, "So what if you've managed to block off the heavenly waterfall for now?" The lake water continued to gather in the air. The more you try to suppress them, the greater the power they will gather. The longer it takes, the stronger the accumulated power will be. I don't believe that you'll be able to continue fending them off. This guy must be thinking of attacking me, right? Humph, I'd like to see how you're going to break through a sword formation formed from over 1,000 aquatic sword cheese. As Fang Xinjian pondered, over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese spread out in the lake were all activated. Countless water threads shot out, encompassing Ada's entire body and turning her into a huge water ball with a diameter of over 50 meters. No matter what kind of attack it would be able to absorb and neutralize it in an instant. It was easy to see how resistant water was to attack. Even if a force of several thousand tons were to hit the surface of the sea, it would only cause a huge splash. With the water ball with a diameter of 50 meters, how strong would the attack have to be in order to reach Ada? However, just as Ada was thinking of this, Fang Xinjian suddenly made a turn and dashed toward the surface of the lake. What is he trying to do? Just as Ada was thinking of this, Fang Xinjian clasped his fists together and raised them high above his head. His body swelled up abruptly, and violent power shot out in all directions, causing the air to tremble and explode, releasing a series of explosive sounds. At the next moment, Fang Xinjian plunged down like a meteor, his fists hammering down fiercely. A series of rumbling explosions rang out, and at the instant when Fang Xinjian's fists came into contact with the surface of the lake, a terrifying power burst forth, gushing out toward the heavenly waterfall lake like a tsunami. Rhoda and the others only felt a huge tremor under their feet, and they felt as if they were unable to stand still. With this punch from Fang Xinjian, the entire heavenly waterfall lake was sent flying into the sky. The power of a single punch had blasted an entire lake's water into the sky. How violent and barbaric was this power! After activating the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, Fang Xinjian had brought out the word violence to the extreme. At the sight of this scene, Ada gasped, almost unable to believe her eyes. At the same time, she felt that the over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese she had painstakingly condensed were all shattered into dust. She had lost control over the entire heavenly waterfall lake. However, at the same time, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor on Fang Xinjian's body also started to fade. He had reached the limits of how much he could use the armor. If he were to continue using it, Damirov's consciousness in the armor might injure him. Ada let out a long breath. The pressure that Fang Xinjian, who was wearing the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor, had given her was far too great. Now that the armor had disappeared, she seemed to have relaxed. However, she was not able to relax for long. Fang Xinjian's fingers were like swords, and with a slight movement, Ada once again opened her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. Chapter 291. As Fang Xinjian moved his sword fingers, the gradually descending heavenly waterfall changed its direction. Impossible! How is this possible? The heavenly waterfall was set up by the second-generation headmaster. Even the aquatic sword formation is unable to control it. If the fifth prince had not created the heavenly waterfall based on the flow of the heavenly waterfall lake and the principles of the aquatic sword formation, even I would not be able to control the heavenly waterfall. How on earth did Fang Xinjian do it? Many thoughts flashed through Ada's mind at lightning speed. However, they were unable to stop the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky. It was as if a white waterfall had cut across the sky and pressed down toward Ada. Before it even got close, strong gales were already gushing toward Ada, almost making it hard for her to breathe. The water vapor in the sky had also arrived in advance, as if a rainstorm had descended from the sky. Behind Ada, the female student who was wearing a swimsuit was screaming with a pale face. With her abilities, it was impossible for her to fend off the impact of the heavenly waterfall. She would probably be smashed into pieces. Ada let out a furious bellow, and streams of aquatic sword cheese condensed on her body. She continued to absorb the lake water to envelop her body. She used one of her sword fingers to control the aquatic sword formation, while her other hand pointed toward the ground. Her aura suddenly changed, as if she had turned into a majestic mountain standing there. As the guardian of the third stage, she had naturally mastered the mountain shifting sword of the second stage. As she activated the mountain shifting sword, she had already connected herself with the surrounding terrain in order to fend off the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky. At the next moment, it was as if the Milky Way was sweeping down, and the heavenly waterfall crashed fiercely onto Ada's sword formation. However, it was as if an egg had been torn apart. The ball of water that could fend off the main cannons of a battleship was instantly crushed. Then the heavenly waterfall continued to attack Ada's body mercilessly. Ada felt as if a mountain had smashed down on her body. The bones in her body let out a series of creaking sounds, and she spewed out a large mouthful of blood. At the next moment, she was completely engulfed by the water, falling into the lake. At the same time, the ground trembled violently as if it was a magnitude 5 earthquake. Ada had used the mountain shifting sword to shift the attack she had received onto the ground. The sky waterfall returned to normal once again. Fang Xinjian slowly returned to the shore. Rhoda and the others were all shocked to the core. Just then, a series of explosive sounds rang out from the lake, and Ada dashed out with the female cadet in hand. With just a few steps, she landed on the shore. The female student at the side was still in a state of shock, and her entire body was drenched in the lake water. Ada, who was at the side, was also panting heavily. Her face was pale, and there were many broken bones all over her body. Her internal organs were bleeding, and her spine was also severely injured. In fact, if she had not used the profoundness of the mountain shifting sword to divert most of the attack, her body would have been torn to pieces. Even so, her injuries were still very serious, but she still insisted on raising her head. She looked at Fang Xinjian and murmured, "You. How did you control the sky waterfall? This is the heavenly waterfall created by the second-generation headmaster. Even the aquatic sword formation is unable to control it. How did you control it?" Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Didn't you control it? I learned from you." "Learned from me?" Ada's expression became agitated. "That's the sky waterfall / not the aquatic sword formation. You haven't even learned the sky waterfall / before, so how did you learn from me? Didn't you use it in front of me? I saw you use it once and you learned it." "Learned it after seeing me use it once?" Ada looked at Fang Xinjian in a daze, her eyes filled with doubt. "How is that possible?" Fang Xinjian said casually, "There's nothing impossible about it. It's just an application of the aquatic sword qi. Using the principle of water vapor rising and cold air sinking, it allows the sky waterfall to temporarily break through its limit. I'll be able to understand it with just one look." These words caused Ada's countenance to change drastically. She had not expected that Fang Xinjian would be able to so casually explain the principle behind the sky waterfall / Back then, even though she had heard the fifth prince explain this principle, she had only started to gradually understand it after comprehending it for a few days. Fang Xinjian had actually learned it after seeing her use it once? In that instant, a great sense of defeat surged up in Ada's chest. She suddenly thought of how the fifth prince had also sat quietly before the heavenly waterfall lake for an entire day and night before he was able to create this sky waterfall / Yet, Fang Xinjian had managed to learn it with just one look. Although the fifth prince cultivated fist techniques, and creating it was much harder than learning it just by seeing it, this still dealt a blow to Ada's confidence in the fifth prince. The Fang Xinjian before her seemed to overlap with the fifth prince. At that moment, Ada's confidence in the fifth prince was no longer as strong as before. "I must inform the fifth prince. I'll send a message immediately." This Fang Xinjian's talent is really extraordinary. However, Fang Xinjian asked, "Can we head to the fourth stage now?" Ada lifted her head, took a long look at Fang Xinjian and said, "There's no need for you to be anxious. There's no guardian for the fourth stage of the Killing Techniques Palace. After all, the purpose of defeating the guardian in the first 3 stages is to learn the sword technique for the next stage. The fourth stage is the final stage. Once you learn the sword technique, you'll be able to come out directly. There's no need for you to defeat the guardian." Hearing Ada's words, everyone present regained their senses and turned to look at Fang Xinjian. This meant that at this moment, Fang Xinjian had already cleared all 4 stages of the Killing Techniques Palace. The student who had followed Fang Xinjian from the first stage mumbled, "Clearing all stages of the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Has something like this ever happened in the Academy's history? No. No one has ever done something like this. This Fang Xinjian has created history. We've all become witnesses to history." Ada took a few deep breaths and then brought the other female students with her to treat their injuries. Fang Xinjian and the others headed to the next stage to learn the final sword technique in the Killing Techniques Palace. Simultaneously, another group of people walked over from the entrance of the Killing Techniques Palace. It was Holt, who was dressed in aristocratic attire and appeared suave and elegant, like an elegant young master. As a student under the tutelage of a divine-level expert, he was also the one who had come in second in the regional selection after losing to Fang Xinjian. Next to Holt was a man with big eyes and a skinny figure. When his eyes opened and closed, spiritual chi would seep out from them. The man looked at Holt and smiled, saying, "Holt, you'll definitely be able to create a new record in the Killing Techniques Palace this time around. You've attained Heaven's perception in less than a month and even completed the second transition. There aren't many people in history who have done this. Even that Fang Xinjian from your batch. I heard that he's still training day and night in the Sacred Land, right? I heard that he even wasted his time creating his own nurturing sword technique. For us to create our own nurturing sword techniques is too much of an overstatement. Today, you'll start challenging the Killing Techniques Palace. With your talent, you'll be able to clear all 4 stages in half a month at most. By then, you'll definitely be able to suppress that Fang Xinjian." Chapter 292. As the disciple of a divine-level expert, he was doted on by the divine-level expert, who had even created the snake of engulfment just for him. Moreover, Holt's talent was 1 in a million. Therefore, an existence like Holt would naturally have many people following him wherever he went, or rather, wanting to get close to him. This was the case for the few people around him. This was especially so for the quick-witted man who had spoken earlier. His name was Norman, and he had been following Holt the most for the past month. He had often helped Holt to flatter him. Norman was ranked 41st in the academy, at level 22, and he cultivated archery. However, he was already 39 years old, and there was still 1 more year before he would turn 40. This meant that his achievements in martial arts would only be SOSO for the rest of his life. It was basically impossible for him to make any great progress. This was also a problem that many conferred knights had encountered. They might be able to cultivate very quickly at the knight stage, but when they reached the conferred knight stage, they would realize that they were lacking in terms of their mental state and will, as well as their lack of talent in comprehending ether particles. People like this would usually leave the academy when they reached a bottleneck after realizing that they did not have any talent. With their status as conferred knights, they would usually be able to get a good job after graduation, as well as a respectable status. However, Norman's ambitions were even greater. He could have graduated 5 years ago, but he had stayed behind to get to know more conferred knights and to make preparations for where he would go after graduation. To him, Holt's appearance was like honey that had appeared before a black bear. Regardless of which corner of the world he was in, there would be unparalleled benefits to being able to form a relationship with a divine-level expert. As the disciple of a divine-level expert, Holt was naturally used to people like this, and he even enjoyed it. Hearing Norman's words, Holt smiled and said, "Thankfully, the melancholic monarch's reward allowed me to quickly attain heaven's perception. That Fang Xinjian really has great talent. If not for the fortuitous encounter at the Pantheon Monument, I'd probably need another half a year to surpass him completely. However, I reckon that he should have just completed the second transition. I wonder when he'll come to the Killing Techniques Palace." Norman tactfully said, "Haha, when that guy comes over, he'll probably be staring at you with his eyes wide open. Moreover, your job is the Astral Sword Saint. Among all the second transition jobs, this should be the best, right? Astral Sword Saint. I heard that the Astral Ancestor, Holt's Grandmaster, one of the divine-level experts of this generation, used to have a second transition job as the Astral Sword Saint." The other students who had followed Holt also started to suck up to him, saying, "With your talent in sword arts, it'll take at most half a month to clear the Killing Techniques Palace." "That's right. If we use the level 29 Crimson Flame, we should be able to clear the dungeon in a few days." Holt shook his head and said, "I'm here to learn. It's meaningless to rely on a divine weapon to pass." The few of them chatted and laughed as they entered the Great Hall, arriving at the first level of the Killing Techniques Palace. However, right now there was no one in the Killing Techniques Palace which taught the Thunderbolt sword technique. There was only the charred ground, the damaged walls, and the lonely huge sword in the middle of the palace. "What's going on? Where is he? Is the time correct?" "That's right. At this time, it should have just started in the afternoon. Why isn't there a single teacher here?" Norman also frowned as he looked at the damaged area. He then smiled and said to Holt, "He's probably eating or going to the toilet. Let's wait for a while." Holt nodded. After all, he felt that he had unrivaled talent and did not need any teacher to guide him. He did not care if there was anyone around or not. He walked up and started to read through the Thunderbolt sword technique on the huge sword. The Thunderbolt sword technique was truly an interesting sword technique. As Holt read on, he became fascinated. Therefore, 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed, 15 minutes passed, but there was still no one here. Norman said impatiently, "What's wrong with the sword arts department? Why isn't there a single person here? This is too ridiculous." Holt smiled, "It's fine. It's fine if I'm the only one reading it. This Thunderbolt sword technique is really extensive and profound. I should be able to learn it in just 1 or 2 days." "Amazing. I heard that the students in the sword arts department spent 1 to 2 weeks before they managed to learn this sword technique." Holt, as expected of a divine-level expert's disciple. "However, you should also be the most powerful person in this generation in the Myriad Stars Palace." Hearing the flattery from the people next to him, Holt smiled and accepted it. It was true that he was proud of his talent, but for some reason, he thought of Fang Xinjian. This opponent who had defeated him in the regional selection had always been a thorn in his heart. "I must continue to work hard. I mustn't slack off. After I clear the Killing Techniques Palace and synthesize these 4 sets of sword techniques, I'll look for an opportunity to have another showdown with Fang Xinjian." Just as they were talking, the sound of footsteps rang out. Everyone turned and saw a few middle-aged or even elderly conferred knights walking over. "Really? This is too unbelievable? Even if it's just 2 stages consecutively, it's already breaking the record. In the 200 years since the Empire was founded, there has never been such a thing." Faint voices rang out, and when everyone saw the 2 old men in the lead, their expressions turned solemn. Hops, the pillar of the Academy's sword arts department, who was leading a sword arts team by himself, stood at the very front. Next to him was an elderly man with a face full of wrinkles. This elderly man was older, but his status was also higher than Hops. He was the old man who had guarded the Pantheon Monument and watched as Fang Xinjian broke through to the 7th level of the mysteries. He was the governor from 2 generations ago, James. Seeing James leading Hops and a few other conferred knights into the hall, Holt's countenance turned serious and he said, "Teachers, why are you guys here? Lord James, you've come out as well?" James, the governor from 2 generations ago, waved his hand and said, "I'm no longer guarding the monument. However, that lad Devitt insisted that I do something. There's no other way. I'm a sword practitioner to begin with, so I replaced Hop's position and became the head of the Sword Arts Department." The head of the Sword Arts Department was naturally the person who managed the entire Academy's Sword Arts Department. This position had originally been taken up by Hops, a sword arts expert who had invented many sword techniques and killing techniques, and was the leader of the Academy's sword arts team. However, with James' status, and experience, Hops could only give in to him. Moreover, Hop's main focus was on sword arts, and was not too interested in those administrative positions. Holt smiled and said, "I've also just come here to learn the Thunderbolt sword technique." Norman, who was standing at the side, tactfully said, "Holt completed the second transition yesterday. In a month's time, he attained Heaven's perception and found his second transition job, the Astral Sword Saint. Holt will probably be able to attain a breakthrough in the Killing Techniques Palace within a month or 2. The corners of Holt's lips curled up slightly, and there was a hint of smugness on his face. Putting aside the fact that he had spent very little time and was very fast, there were not many people in the history of the Astral Sword Saint job. This was especially so for his Grandmaster, the divine-level expert Astral Ancestor. He had already been an Astral Sword Saint when he had completed his second transition. Moreover, the Astral Sword Saint was able to control astral forces, astral rays, astral storms, and other powers, possessing powerful battle prowess and destructive prowess. Seeing how everyone was chatting, James, the governor from 2 generations ago, nodded and said, "Not bad, not bad." However, there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. Hops did not have that much patience and went straight to the point. "All right, have you guys seen where Fang Xinjian is?" Chapter 293. A group of people followed behind James and the others, while Holt and the others followed suit. The 2 groups made many turns and arrived before a huge crater. Hops was still seriously analyzing the situation in the valley and said, "The one on duty today should be Ronan. His mountain-shifting sword has already reached level 15 and he has grasped the earth-bearing sword. He's able to connect himself with the entire valley. By the looks of it, that's what he's doing." Shaking their heads, the group once again followed James and headed for the next stage. "That's right. I've long heard that Fang Xinjian does as he pleases and is extremely daring. Could he have barged into the Killing Techniques Palace? Or injured someone?" Holt's countenance sank. If Fang Xinjian were to pass 2 stages consecutively, Holt had no confidence that he would be able to catch up to him and surpass him. However, the appearance of the headmaster from 2 generations ago, the current head of the Sword Arts Department, James, as well as the sword arts expert Holt, gave Holt a bad premonition. A surge of indignation rose in Holt's heart, and he thought inwardly, "Is there really such a great difference between the talents of the 5th and 7th levels of the Pantheon Monument?" Holt nodded and said, "It's fine. I'd thought that he lacked legacies and would need to spend a lot of time preparing for the second transition. I should be able to surpass him this time around. To think that he would be able to complete the second transition so quickly. Maybe the job he has chosen is more ordinary. Moreover, even if he succeeds in his job transition and comes to the Killing Techniques Palace, he shouldn't be much earlier than me. He might be in the second stage." Hearing James' question, Hops said, 5 days. I spent 5 days before I managed to learn the mountain-shifting sword and then found the flaws of my teacher back then." The people in the surroundings could only smile awkwardly, but no one took it seriously. Instead, they started to secretly evaluate Fang Xinjian's value once again. In his calculations, this was already his limit. Therefore, he believed that even if Fang Xinjian was faster than him, it would not be by much. Holt was well aware of how fast he had managed to attain heaven's perception and then complete the second transition. In order to catch up and surpass Fang Xinjian, he had been training crazily day and night for the past month. He had even used up quite a number of extremely valuable resources. Only then had he been able to successfully complete all of this within such a short period of time. Could it be Fang Xinjian? Fang Xinjian? But he subconsciously ignored this feeling, or rather, did not want to think about it. Looking at the huge crater, head of department James laughed and said, "It seems that the second stage has been cleared as well." Hops, do you still remember how long you took to clear the second stage? However, there was only 1 year left before the national selection next year. It would be a pity if Fang Xinjian couldn't participate in such an important national selection. Norman smiled and said, "No matter what, he's the regional champion and has even cleared all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries. If he's been seriously injured, it's normal for head of department James and teacher Hops to be so concerned. It might not necessarily be that he's injured someone. Fang Xinjian has only been in the academy for less than a month. He might have been injured by someone else. But it was still broken by a single sword attack from Fang Xinjian, and even the entire canyon was destroyed." Head of department James smiled and said, "This Fang Xinjian is a bully. He must have used that sword attack he learned from the Pantheon Monument, right?" With that, Norman sneaked a glance in Holt's direction and noticed that the latter's complexion had improved a lot. After all, in Miracle World, as long as one was strong enough, conferred knights would have the space to be willful. "Even if my talent is much weaker, I'll definitely catch up to you." Fang Xinjian must have used at most 1 to 2 hours. His talent in clearing the Pantheon Monument is really amazing. Head of department James was even more tempted by Fang Xinjian's talent and the profoundness of the Pantheon Monument. Therefore, he said, "Why don't we take a look?" Everyone present understood what head of department James meant and nodded in agreement. It was true. If Fang Xinjian had come to the academy a few years earlier, it would be hard to imagine how much he would have grown. He would have even been able to participate in the national selection next year. Otherwise, why would so many of us be here? Hops waved his hand impatiently. He was someone who was obsessed with sword arts, did not care about his appearance, and hated formalities. How would he have the patience to talk nonsense with these few rascals? The leader of the sword arts team, Hops, was still checking out the situation in the canyon with a solemn expression, trying to determine the situation of the battle. James shook his head and sighed. "It's a pity, a pity. If only he had come a few years earlier." At the thought of this, Holt did not say a word and continued to chase after the next round. The people around him looked at each other and followed suit. However, even though they did not know this, no one in the group brought up the matter of Holt catching up to and surpassing Fang Xinjian anymore. This made Holt feel even more displeased. Holt walked out and said calmly, "Then let's go take a look." As he spoke, Hops had already pulled James, the headmaster from 2 generations ago, out and headed for the next stage. The few people who had been following him said, "Why don't we go in and take a look?" Not only that. Hops squatted down and touched the sand on the ground, saying, "First, he used the move of absorbing gravity to break Ronan's balance. Then he blasted the gravity upwards and lifted the ground downwards, combining the 2 swords into one and defeating Ronan in one go." Although no one said anything, they were increasingly curious about which stage Fang Xinjian had cleared. If they knew that this was Fang Xinjian's first day in the Killing Techniques Palace, they would probably be even more curious. Moreover, his abilities, status, and reputation were sufficient for him to do as he pleased. Hearing the word person, everyone present was slightly stunned. Norman smiled and asked, "Teacher Hops, you're saying that Fang Xinjian has also come here?" "There's still a chance. If he catches up to Fang Xinjian in the Killing Techniques Palace. Looking at the crowd leaving without hesitation, Norman smiled awkwardly at Holt and said, I didn't expect that Fang Xinjian has also come to the Killing Techniques Palace. Behind them, Holt and the others looked at the huge crater in astonishment. One of them had cultivated sword arts, and had also cleared the Killing Techniques Palace before. He looked at the scene and said, This was originally a canyon. Why has it been filled up? How else can it be filled up? There must have been a battle. Norman smiled awkwardly and said, Maybe there were other seniors clearing the stages, and Fang Xinjian just happened to be there. Ha 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 ha. Norman threw a glance at Holt. He had followed Holt for a month and had a better understanding of his temperament. He knew that Holt came from a prestigious clan and was not thick-skinned. Therefore, he said, Earlier, the two sirs asked about Fang Xinjian. Maybe this Fang Xinjian has stirred up trouble again. Chapter 294. The group continued to advance, and in the blink of an eye, they arrived at the heavenly waterfall lake in the third stage. Looking at the heavenly waterfall descending from the sky, everyone's faces were filled with varying degrees of astonishment. Hops sighed and said, The work of the second-generation headmaster is still astonishing each time I look at it. This heavenly waterfall lake is truly a work of uncanny workmanship, majestic and majestic. However, head of department James had long since started laughing. Ha 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 ha, there's no one again? To clear the entire Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Ha 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 ha, Hops, has there ever been such a person in the history of the Great Western Region's Regional Academy? No. Hops shook his head and said, It's not just the Great Western Region that hasn't had such a thing happen in the Empire's 8 regions. Fang Xinjian is the first. James nodded in satisfaction and said, He must be learning the lightless sword in the 4th stage. Let's not disturb him and just wait for him here. With that, James took the lead and sat down at the side of the heavenly waterfall lake. It was as if he was admiring the scenery of the heavenly waterfall lake. The many conferred knights exchanged glances. One of them, a man with a scar on his face, frowned and said, Sir, although Fang Xinjian is extremely talented and has outstanding talent, it's not good to let so many teachers and seniors wait for him here. It won't be a good influence, and he'll probably be terrified himself. If one were to translate this, it would probably mean that they were giving Fang Xinjian too much face. By waiting for him like this, they were giving him face, but where were they going to put their faces? It was a pity that head of department James did not care about his face at all. What a joke. The reason why he had become the head of the sword arts department was because he had taken a fancy to Fang Xinjian's talent. He had also wanted to persuade Fang Xinjian to reveal the 7 levels of mysteries of the Pantheon Monument to the Regional Academy. What seniority did James have? He was the headmaster from 2 generations ago. At his age, it was no longer possible for him to have great improvements in his martial arts. What he cared about was his reputation, the Academy's future, and the Empire's future. Now that he saw Fang Xinjian's stunning performance once again, the latter had already become a delicious piece of juicy meat in his eyes. He could not help but have a thought in his mind, and that was to protect and escort Fang Xinjian. Therefore, when he heard the knife-scarred man's words, he curled his lips and said, If you were to clear the Killing Techniques Palace consecutively in a single day, I'll wait for you however long you want me to. Scarface was embarrassed by his words and couldn't help but retort, You can't just rely on learning speed to determine who's better, right? There are so many seniors here. Which one of them isn't above him in terms of level, strength, synchronization rate, fame, and status? He was trying to drag the others along with him. However, no one echoed his words. Instead, head of department James laughed coldly and said, We are all martial artists. If we don't compete in martial arts, what should we compete in? Are you comparing who is older and who eats more? He sneered and said, Why would the national selection appear? It was to be able to select the most talented, and whoever was the most powerful would be selected. Let me ask you this. Were any of you even half as amazing as Fang Xinjian when you were his age? A 17-year-old genius. His rapid growth period is at least 20 to 30 years away. By the time he reaches your age, what level will he be at? Regardless of whether it was Scarface or the other teachers, they were all rendered speechless at this moment. It was because the talent that Fang Xinjian had displayed was so unreasonable. Head of Department James, who had unified his thoughts, nodded in satisfaction. Although Fang Xinjian's talent was amazing, it did not mean that everyone would listen to you or help you just because you were talented. Even if the previous pope had unrivaled battle prowess and was unrivaled in the world, it would still have been impossible for him to unify the world, much less get everyone to listen to him. This was why James cherished talents and wanted to protect and escort Fang Xinjian. Another teacher pointed to Holt and the others in the distance and said, "Should we let them go?" James threw a glance over and said calmly, "It doesn't matter." In the distance, Holt, Norman, and the others, who had been following James and the others, saw that James and the others had stopped. One of the students asked curiously, "Why have they stopped here? What are they waiting for?" Another student looked at the empty heavenly waterfall lake and said, "Could it be that Fang Xinjian has already cleared the third stage?" At the thought of this possibility, everyone fell silent. Norman threw a glance at Holt's furrowed brows and said with an awkward smile, "Look, aren't Lord James and the others waiting here? What does this mean?" "This means that based on their judgment, Fang Xinjian has yet to clear this stage. That's why they're waiting here." The more he said, the clearer his thoughts became, and his tone became more and more confident. He continued to say, "What level is Lord James at? What sword arts cultivation does Master Hops have? Since they're waiting here, it must be because Fang Xinjian has yet to clear the third stage. That's why they're waiting here." His tone was filled with certainty, and everyone present nodded in agreement. However, just then, someone said in a soft voice, "Maybe they're waiting for Fang Xinjian to come back from the fourth stage. There's no one guarding the last stage in the Killing Techniques Palace." Norman glared at the person who had spoken and said, "You're talking about the headmaster from 2 generations ago, James. You're talking about the leader of the sword arts team, Hops, and so many teachers waiting here for a newbie like Fang Xinjian? Do you think that's possible?" The person who had spoken also felt that it was not very possible and scratched his head in embarrassment. However, Holt's expression was still a little gloomy. Hearing everyone's guesses, he could not help but say, "All right, let's not talk anymore. Let's just wait here." Therefore, everyone sat down cross-legged and started to wait. They were waiting for the possibility that even they did not know the outcome. Half an hour, 1 hour, about 1 hour and 15 minutes later, everyone's faces were filled with a trace of impatience. At this moment, from the direction of a small path on the opposite side of the heavenly waterfall lake, 4 figures slowly walked over. They were Fang Xinjian, Rhoda, and the 2 students who had led the way. James laughed out loud and led the others to welcome them. He asked with a hint of anticipation in his eyes, "Xinjian, you've passed the 4th stage in the Killing Techniques Palace?" Seeing the sudden appearance of such a large group of people, as well as the solemn-looking teachers standing before them, the 2 students became nervous. They had never seen such a big lineup before. Almost half of the leaders of the Sword Arts Department were standing before them. What situation was this? This was especially so for this old man who was unkempt and looked like a withered tree branch. Anyone who had participated in the regional selection and comprehended the Pantheon Monument would know that he was the Academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago. And for so many people to appear here, there was only one possibility: Fang Xinjian. The 2 of them turned to look at Fang Xinjian, their gazes filled with envy and jealousy. This was especially so for Fang Xinjian, who was only 17 years old. Right now, what everyone saw on his face was not youth and immaturity, but a bright future that shone brightly. Chapter 295. Looking at Head of Department James, although Fang Xinjian felt that it was a little strange, he still nodded and said, "I've just learned the 4th stage's lightless sword." As he spoke, he activated the mountain shifting sword and pinched a stone spike in his hand. Then, with a sweep of the stone sword, the space within a range of 100 meters instantly darkened. It was as if the sun in the sky had been blocked by a thick layer of clouds. However, there were no clouds in the sky right now. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was because the lightless sword Fang Xinjian had activated had gathered the sun's divine light, gathering all the radiation from the sun within a range of 100 meters onto the longsword in his hand. The stone sword in his hand had turned into a white sword of light. Under the high temperature, it even continued to heat up the air, releasing hints of white steam. Seeing this scene, Head of Department James laughed out loud. His face, which was already filled with wrinkles, was now like an old piece of bark, filled with crisscrossing ravines. The eyes of the Sword Arts Master Hops, who was the leader of the Regional Academy's Sword Arts Research Group, also lit up. Excellent! Clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Xinjian, what you've done today will definitely be recorded in history. It won't be long before your name is known throughout the world. The teachers at the side all wore gazes of great astonishment, envy, and admiration. Clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day sounded very cool. However, only conferred knights like them, who had walked out of the Killing Techniques Palace, truly knew how difficult it was. This was not something that could be achieved just by saying it like a child. The amount of effort, hard work, preparation, talent, and foundation required was unimaginable. They suddenly thought of what Head of Department James had said earlier. When Fang Xinjian reached their age, what level would Fang Xinjian have reached? Holt, Norman, and the others, who had been standing in the distance, had unknowingly walked over and listened to the conversation between Fang Xinjian and the others. When they heard that Fang Xinjian had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day and learned the killing techniques in the 4 stages, their expressions were extremely interesting. Holt could not help but step forward. He stared into Fang Xinjian's eyes and asked, "Fang Xinjian, you've learned 4 sets of killing techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day?" Seeing that Fang Xinjian had nodded, Holt's tone was filled with doubt. "But learning 4 sets of killing techniques in a single day? I don't understand. How on earth did you do it?" Although Holt's sudden appearance was a little abrupt, his question was one that everyone present was curious about. Therefore, no one stopped him. Instead, all of them looked at Fang Xinjian, as if waiting for his answer. Fang Xinjian gave it some thought and said, "Xinjian's talent. I can pick up any sword technique just by looking at it a few times. I'm Xinjian." Killing techniques that Fang Xinjian saying, at I Xinjian, Fang, Holt. Xinjian Holt had thought of a bunch of theories and logic to refute Fang Xinjian's reply. If he could not refute Fang Xinjian, he could go back and try it out himself, then think of a way to surpass Fang Xinjian. However, Fang Xinjian's answer was so simple. To conferred knights like them, who had been training hard day and night, wanting to learn killing techniques, synthesize killing techniques, make up for their weaknesses and increase their abilities, Fang Xinjian's talent was like a cheat code. However, James immediately said in a deep voice, "All right, Xinjian, let's not talk about this anymore." He knew how much hatred Fang Xinjian's words would attract. If a bunch of people who had been cultivating sword arts for over 10 years or decades were to hear Fang Xinjian's words, they would be overwhelmed by jealousy and be so infuriated that they would vomit blood. Therefore James said, "Also, don't spread what we've just said." Holt asked again, a little unwilling to give up, "What's the maximum level for your sword arts?" He stared at Fang Xinjian, as if he would charge up if Fang Xinjian did not answer this question. Right now, Fang Xinjian did not plan on hiding as much as he had done in the past. Right now, He had terra ingurgitation, boundaries negation, and 4 new killing techniques. He also had a level 29 superior divine armor protecting him. Therefore, he had fewer and fewer reservations. Moreover, he was still improving at an unbelievable speed. Therefore, he did not say much, but still said, "Usually, it's around level 20 to 30. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, Holt felt as if a rumble rang out in his mind, as if many thunderbolts had swept past him. Level 20 to 30? Holt's current highest sword technique was at level 20, which was already at the maximum level. Yet, Fang Xinjian was able to reach level 30 at the maximum? What kind of concept was this? What a terrifying talent! Everyone at the side also drew in a cold gasp. Usually, they would not even dare to think about a sword technique at the maximum level from level 20 to 30. People like Ronan and Duoluan, who had trained their sword arts to level 15, were already rare geniuses who could enter the regional academy and become conferred knights. Those who were slightly stronger, like Holt and the top 10 in the academy, would be able to push their techniques to around level 20. From this comparison, one could tell how astonishing Fang Xinjian's talent was. Moreover, he had reduced his level by 10. He had transitioned into a second transition job, the Heavenly Sword Sovereign, and his job specialty, the Heavenly Sword Imprint, was able to increase the maximum of his sword arts by 10 levels. James, the head of department, coughed and said, "All right, it's enough that everyone knows about this. Don't spread it out." With that, his gaze suddenly turned sharp. "If I hear any related news from the outside, don't blame me for being impolite." This was a gag order. No one was allowed to reveal any information regarding Fang Xinjian's sword arts levels. After saying a few words with a straight face, James smiled and looked at Fang Xinjian, saying, "Xinjian, the results you've achieved this time around have exceeded my expectations. Once the news of you clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day spreads out, our Great Western Region Regional Academy will also be in the limelight. What requests do you have? Tell me now. If I can make the decision, I'll definitely agree to it." Hops also said, "Xinjian, although you've rejected me twice, I still have to say that with your talent, it'll be a great waste if you don't join my sword arts team." Hearing that Fang Xinjian had rejected Hops twice, the expressions of the others became even more interesting. There were quite a few of them who had wanted to join Hops' team. However, right now they could only look at Fang Xinjian with an envious gaze akin to that of a kitten or puppy. Hearing that, James also said solemnly, "Xinjian, there are still many benefits to joining Hops' team. You'll be able to obtain many of the most advanced information and theories there. If you're worried about wasting too much time, how about this? You can choose to accept the arrangements of the laboratory. If you have any other requests, just tell me. I'll definitely agree to them as long as it's within my capabilities." Hearing James' words, everyone present was astonished once again. However, this was just the beginning. Fang Xinjian gave it some thought and said, "I wish to participate in next year's national selection and get first place. I'll need the Academy's full support." Chapter 296. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, everyone fell silent. Fang Xinjian had just been selected into the regional academy this year, but he was already thinking of participating in the next year's national selection. What would happen in the next year's national selection? That was a level 30 divine remains equipment that would also be treated as a reward, and it would affect the regional academy's budget. Countless experts of the new generation and old monsters would come forth to fight for the first place. How intense would the next year's national selection be? Even if one were to think with their toes, they would know that it would probably be the most intense national selection in decade. And to think that Fang Xinjian, a guy who had just become a conferred knight, was thinking of participating in the national selection 1 year later. When the people present heard Fang Xinjian's words, their first thought was that Fang Xinjian had gone mad. If he was not mad, then he was too arrogant, and did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Holt, Norman, and the others looked at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a lunatic. Just as everyone thought that head of department James would refute Fang Xinjian's arrogant words, James said after some deliberation, "There's not much time left until next year's national selection. If I were to calculate it carefully, there's only a few days left, right? This year's national selection will also be very intense. Without being at the pinnacle of level 29, it'll be impossible for you to get into the top 10. Xinjian, with your talent, you'll be able to accumulate your strength for another 4 years and participate in the next national selection. I guarantee that you'll be able to get first place in that year's national selection." However, Fang Xinjian was unmoved, and Rhoda, who was at the side, was so anxious that her eyes were about to emit flames. Fang Xinjian said, "I'll definitely participate in the next national selection, and I must get first place in it." James rolled his eyes. He had wanted to continue persuading Fang Xinjian, but he suddenly thought of the mechanism of the national selection. He immediately smiled and said, "Xinjian, it's not up to us to decide whether we can participate in the national selection or not. The purpose of the national selection is to select the top 10 existences. As long as you get into the top 10 of the academy, you'll have to participate in the national selection even if you don't want to. We'll naturally support the students who participate in the national selection." James's words were very clear. As long as Fang Xinjian could enter the top 10 in the academy, he would naturally be able to participate in the national selection. They would also support Fang Xinjian. Therefore, regardless of whether Fang Xinjian's goal was the national selection or not, all he needed to do was to strengthen himself and defeat the students from the regional academy. Hops added, "Xinjian, if you join my sword arts team, all the killing techniques and sword techniques we've collected will be open to you. You'll be able to ceaselessly cultivate sword techniques, synthesize them, and increase your abilities." Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "If I can freely arrange my time after joining the group, then I will join." "Of course." Hops smiled. With the talent that Fang Xinjian had displayed today, even if he were to just cultivate the sword techniques in the group, he would be able to greatly increase the progress of the entire group's research. It was because he was a very fast learner. Fang Xinjian gave it some thought and then said to Head of Department James, "Recently, I'm going to publish a book and I'm afraid that I'll encounter some policy restrictions. I hope that you can help me choose a side." Publishing a book? Publishing a book is a good thing. With your sword art standards, it's true that you can publish a book. It's fine, I'll help you personally. I also know many schools, so I'll get them to use your book for their lessons. Just as Fang Xinjian, James, and Hops continued chatting and even started to talk about the research project, the people around them gradually realized that they were unable to understand what they were saying. Norman was not a sword cultivator to begin with, and as he listened to their conversation, the perplexity in his eyes grew. At the start, Holt tried his best to understand, but very soon, he was unable to keep up with their train of thought. He slowly backed off and headed outside. Norman followed behind him and asked, "Aren't you going to listen to what they have to say?" "There's nothing good to listen to. I'm going to cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique." Thinking of Fang Xinjian's talent and learning speed, Holt felt an unprecedented sense of urgency. At the same time, an idea appeared in his mind. "If you're going to participate in next year's national selection, then I'm going to participate as well. Why should I, Holt, be inferior to you? Is it so great just because you're a little more talented?" Thinking of how Fang Xinjian was being surrounded by Head of Department James, Head of Department Hops, and many other teachers, Holt's expression darkened even more. James continued, "Xinjian, how about this? Since you've joined the sword arts team to research sword arts, then I'll have to give you some research funds. I'll give you 50,000 yuan first. Use it sparingly. When you come up with new results, I'll give you more money. A teacher could not help but say, Head of department, this year's budget has already been prepared. Where would we get the extra 50,000? Wouldn't we just have to squeeze a little? James said, blowing on his beard, with Xinjiang's talent, even if it's just the simple cultivation of killing techniques, he'll be able to get a lot of results. How can our academy not support such a talent? Calculate the money first. If it's not enough, I'll just ask Devitt, Governor, for more. Hearing Head of Department James's words, everyone present was secretly excited. This was the benefit of having a high seniority. A head of department like James, who could just barge into the governor's office to ask for money, was someone everyone would want to cozy up to. Thinking of the 50,000 gold, Fang Xinjiang heaved a sigh of relief. With that, he was only halfway to the 100,000 gold required to cultivate the first level of the mystical prince. The few of them then discussed the specific arrangements for the research. Every week, Fang Xinjiang would report to the Sword Tower where the Sword Arts team was located. He would be able to choose the projects that he was interested in to participate in, and he would also be able to freely read through the killing techniques that all the teams had collected. After the discussion, Fang Xinjiang returned to the training room in the Sacred Land and continued his cultivation. The news of him clearing 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day should have gradually spread and started to spread. He believed that Ferdinand would make good use of the time to help him create hype and sell his book. Right now, he needed to make good use of the time to cultivate his sword arts. After all, he now had the 90,000 godly demon flash, the thunderbolt sword technique, the mountain shifting sword, the aquatic sword formation, and the lightless sword, a total of 5 killing techniques. He needed to work hard on cultivating all of them and synthesize them into his own sword technique. At the very least, he would not lack killing techniques to cultivate for the next 1 or 2 months. First was the 90,000 godly demon flash. Fang Xinjiang worked hard on cultivating this set of sword technique, striving to bring it to the maximum level as soon as possible and then synthesize it into his current technique. It was during these few days that Fang Xinjiang had been cultivating that many peddlers pushing carts with books started to appear in the streets and alleys of the great western city. They would often appear outside the various academies, at the gates of the various aristocratic academies, dojos, and knight academies. Seeing the endless stream of knight apprentices coming and going, they would start selling their books loudly. In the north of the great western city, in a school known as the 5-Star Aristocratic Academy, which had a long history and had produced countless knights, Lilia was sweating profusely as she practiced her sword arts seriously. Right now, Lilia was wearing a set of training clothes with short sleeves and shorts. She had a small and muscular figure, but she did not give off a scary feeling. Instead, coupled with her tanned skin, cute face, and twin ponytails, she gave off a healthy and lively feeling. Moreover, her face was very beautiful and exquisite to begin with. As she trained in the training grounds, she attracted everyone's gazes. Chapter 297. Next to her, a young man waved a stack of papers in his hand and said with a smile, Lilia, the new newspapers have arrived. Do you want to read them together? Newspapers were also something that the second prince had recently started. Currently, they were only sold in the capital cities of the 8 major provinces. Due to the scarcity of newspapers, they were only available to the upper echelons of the nobility for the time being. Anyone who could get their hands on one would be able to use it to show off. However, Lilia did not even look at the young man as she continued to wield the sword in her hand and cultivate. That young man did not think much of it. He continued to circle around Lilia and said, These newspapers are all about the major events that have happened in the empire. It's said that the second prince has used his great skill of thoughts across 10,000 li to be able to transmit news quickly. Even if something were to happen in the southern flame region, we would be able to know immediately. Hearing the young man's words, Lilia exhaled, put down the big sword in her hand and said, "Carter, I'm not interested in you. Stop pestering me." This youth by the name of Carter was also a knight apprentice of a 5-star aristocratic school. He was also the most outstanding knight apprentice in recent years. He had always been the king of popularity among the students. However, after Lilia arrived, he realized that Lilia was very different from the aristocratic ladies he knew in the past. He immediately became interested in Lilia. Hearing Lilia say this, Kite was not angry. He only smiled and said, "Lilia, I'll be participating in the prefectural selection next year and becoming a knight. You also know that I could have become a knight a long time ago. It's just that I wanted to accumulate my strength to fight for the prefectural champion, which is why I delayed it until this year." Lilia shook her head. Seeing that it was already late, she walked towards the school gate. Ever since Fang Xinjian had entered the regional academy, she had gotten her father to arrange for him to stay in this school in the Great Western region. She had even rented a room outside the school. Of course, Kite did not know so much. It was impossible for Lilia to directly tell him about her background, identity, and interpersonal relationship. Therefore, in Kite's eyes, Lilia was just a noble girl from a remote area, a rare woman. Seeing that Lilia had left, Kite chased after her and said, "Are you going home, Lilia? I'll send you back. The security in the Great Western region hasn't been very good recently." Seeing that Lilia was still ignoring him, Kite grinned and picked up the newspaper to read. "Oh? The Western Garrison Army chased after the people of Garcia, and I heard that they fought all the way to their own territory. Hee, to think that these black devils of Garcia would dare to come to the Empire and behave atrociously. What a bunch of fools. Oh! The Northern Ice Region's Rellings has come out from seclusion. He said that he will completely crush all the other contestants in next year's national selection, using overwhelming power to become the national champion." Kite said, "This Rellings is amazing. He's said to be the #1 genius in the Northern Ice region in the past 200 years, having been at second transition level 29 for over 10 years. It's said that even the Northern Ice region's governor isn't a match for him. TSK. If it wasn't because the conditions given to him by the Northern Ice region are too good, he would have gone to the Central a long time ago. However, the rewards for the national selection this time around are too good, and Rellings is unable to reject them." Although Lilia did not have any feelings for Kite, she was quite curious about the contents of the newspaper when she heard him talking about the major events in the world. Kite stole a glance at Lilia and realized that Lilia was really listening. This time, he put in even more effort in reading. "The famous Sword of the Southeast, Sasa, has come, and he still wants to be a teacher in the regional academy?" Kite's eyes lit up and he said, "Sasa has the title of Sword Saint in the Eastern Sand region. To think that he has come to our regional academy as well? It'd be great if he could give me some guidance in sword arts in the future." As the two of them walked, Lilia did not say a single word. As Kite spoke, he gradually came to a stop. After all, he was still young and did not have much patience. He could not help but ask, "Lilia, what do I have to do for you to be willing to talk to me? Am I so detestable?" Lilia looked behind Kite, and when Kite saw her gaze, he could not help but turn around as well. He saw a bookseller pushing a cart and calling out his wares. The unrivaled genius Fang Xinjian cleared all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument in the regional selection, cleared 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Fang Xinjian's Sword Learning Secret Manual. Those who want it, come buy a copy. Don't miss this chance. If you miss out on Fang Xinjian's book on the secrets to becoming stronger, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. The peddler called out loudly, and many students were queuing up to buy the book. Kite frowned. This Fang Xinjian is too arrogant. He's publishing a book just like that? What unrivaled genius! Be careful not to become a laughing stock in the other regions. As a top student in his school, he instinctively despised other geniuses who were around the same age as him. He was also 17 years old, the same age as Fang Xinjian. This made him hate Fang Xinjian even more. However, Lilia smiled and said, "Then as long as you can clear all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and clear the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day, I'll talk to you. To tell you the truth, the partner I want to find in the future is a genius like Fang Xinjian." Hearing Lilia's words, Kite was stunned. Regardless of whether it was the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument or the fact that he had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, these were both extremely heavy achievements. Even many level 29 conferred knights would not dare to think of such achievements, let alone Kite. It was possible for Kite to criticize Fang Xinjian, but it would be extremely difficult for him to do the same as Fang Xinjian. Kite was speechless, and could only watch as Lilia happily ran off to buy books from the peddler. Kite let out a cold snort, crushed the newspaper in his hand, and went home angrily. His house was also located in the aristocratic district in the center of the great western city. The moment he entered the hall, he saw that his mother was already there waiting for him. When she saw him, she waved her hand and said, "Kite, come and meet your aunt and uncle. They've come all the way from Harvest City." "Aya, this must be Kite? He's so handsome. What's the use of looks?" Kite's mother grinned and said, "Who still looks at looks nowadays?" Kite smiled and stood at the side, as if he was a statue waiting to be evaluated. He had long since gotten used to such conversations. That depends on one's abilities as well. Your Kite already has the ability to become a knight, right? When will he be participating in the prefectural selection? Next year. Every time this matter was brought up, Kite and his mother would have a hint of pride on their faces. This child could have passed the prefectural selection long ago. We were just worried that he was too young and did not know how to control himself. That's why we trained him for a few more years. Your Kite is really outstanding, unlike that son of mine who only knows how to fool around all day. I'll get him to come over and learn from Kite sometime." Kite appeared to be impatient, but in fact, every time he was praised by the elders, he could not help but feel a little proud. However, at the next moment, his aunt suddenly took out a book and said, "Oh, right. This is a book I bought on my way here. It's said to be Fang Xinjian's biography, and it even has his sword art secrets. You know of Fang Xinjian, right?" Chapter 298. How could I not know? This lad is amazing. Kite's mother seemed to have entered into gossipy mode. Not only did he solve all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries, I heard that he even cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Youngsters nowadays are really amazing. Right? Is this his biography? That's right. I heard that Fang Xinjian wrote it himself. Not only did he talk about his experiences, but he also wrote down the secrets behind his cultivation. I bought 2 of them. One is for our silly son, and the other is for Kate. Thank you. When I heard that this was going to be published, I wanted to buy it. As she spoke, Kite's mother took the book and saw the word Secrets to Sword Training written on it. Kite's brows furrowed, and he could not help but say, "This Fang Xinjian is only 17 years old, about the same age as me. How much content can there be in his biography?" "Kite, you're wrong to say this. Don't blame me for reprimanding you. Fang Xinjian is really capable and talented," Kite's aunt said. "Do you know about the Pantheon Monument? That's something left behind by the divine-level expert from 200 years ago, the melancholic monarch. 200 years have passed and no one has been able to solve all 7 levels. Fang Xinjian is the first person to do so. And you guys know about the Killing Techniques Palace, right? That's so difficult. Back then, eldest brother took an entire year to clear the Killing Techniques Palace. I heard that even Governor Devitt took a month to clear it. Look at this Fang Xinjian. He managed to clear it within a day. It's really infuriating to compare oneself with others. In order to let more people understand the mysteries behind the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and how he had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, Ferdinand had added a lot of introductions to the Pantheon Monument and the Killing Techniques Palace. There was no other way about it. Many aristocrats who did not cultivate in martial arts or commoners of the lower class were not very clear about such high-level knowledge. In order to highlight how amazing Fang Xinjian was, Ferdinand had no choice but to explain in detail the existence of the Killing Techniques Palace and the unique characteristics of the Pantheon Monument. After reading it, everyone realized how heavy Fang Xinjian's achievement this time was. It could even be said to be frightening. Kite's mother stuffed a book into Kite's arms and said, "Look, you're both 17 years old, but he has already become a conferred knight. What are you still doing? Take a good look at the book written by Fang Xinjian and learn the secrets within." Kite instantly felt an incomparable tightness in his chest. He only felt that the name Fang Xinjian was becoming more and more annoying. However, things did not change according to his will. He did not know if it was intentional or not, but the second prince's newspaper had also published the news that Fang Xinjian had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. This was like adding fuel to the fire. In this miracle world, which was equivalent to the Earth's Middle Ages, it was extremely difficult for ordinary people to send messages. Usually, only those pinnacle experts would be able to send messages across thousands of leagues. Moreover, they would be subjected to various restrictions. Therefore, the speed at which news was transmitted across the entire miracle world was not very fast. The newspaper that the second prince had created relied on his killing technique, thoughts across 10,000 leagues, to easily transmit news across long distances. For example, this time around, the news of Fang Xinjian clearing the Killing Techniques Palace within a day had spread to the capitals of each of the 8 regions. This allowed Fang Xinjian's name to enter the sights of all of the empire's upper echelon. If all of the world's leaders were to read a newspaper, how great would the influence of that newspaper be? Right now, Fang Xinjian's fame was just that great. Moreover, he had solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries and cleared all 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Either one of these 2 achievements was enough for one to boast about for the rest of his life. They were both extremely heavy and could attract the attention of anyone. Moreover, both of these achievements had appeared simultaneously on Fang Xinjian's shoulders. In a small alley in the Great Western City. This was the slum of the Great Western City's commoners. It was where countless refugees, gangs, and fugitives resided. In such a dark and dangerous street, an old granny was walking blindly. She wore clothes made of coarse cloth and her face was covered by a veil. She looked just like an ordinary old granny from the commoners. Just as she was halfway there, a group of children suddenly dashed out with small knives in their hands. "Don't move! If you move again, I'll chop you to death." The children snatched away the old granny's basket and the food in it. Another child picked up a book from the basket and looked at the word Secrets to Sword Training. However, he was illiterate and could not understand the contents of the book. The child said fiercely, "What book is this? Is it a secret manual for martial arts?" "This is not a secret manual." The old granny's hands were clenched tightly unknowingly, and there seemed to be a baleful aura circulating in her eyes. However, she still held it in and said, "This is Secrets to Sword Training, the book written by Fang Xinjian." When she said the words Fang Xinjian, the old granny's teeth seemed to be clenched tightly together, as if she was gnashing her teeth. If Fang Xinjian was here, he would definitely be able to recognize the old granny. She was Kaunitz's aunt, Treja clan's Rebecca. Rebecca had escaped when Fang Xinjian was being surrounded and attacked. Later on, she was placed on the wanted list for treason. However, she was a level 19 knight after all and had managed to escape. She had even hidden in the Great Western City, plotting something. However, she could only disguise herself as an old granny from the commoners. She even had to put up with a bunch of kids who were only in their teens, not daring to lay a hand on them. To Rebecca, who had grown up in an aristocratic family, this was a great humiliation and agony. Every time this happened, she would hate Fang Xinjian even more. However, she still had to put up with it. If she were to take action here, she would be discovered immediately. How many conferred knights were there in the great western city? Any one of them would be able to crush her to death with a single finger. Therefore, she could only patiently explain, "It's just a storybook, not a secret manual." However, the eyes of the kid before her suddenly lit up and he said, "It's this year's regional champion, Fang Xinjian? The genius who solved all 10 levels of the Saint's Monument's mysteries? I heard that he's also a commoner?" Rebecca let out a breath and said, "It's not the Saint's Monument, it's the Pantheon Monument, and it's not the 10 levels of mysteries either." She lifted her head and looked at the kid before her, wondering why she was explaining all this to them. Therefore, she said, "It's him." The kid shoved the book into Rebecca's arms and said coldly, "Read it for us." Fury rose in Rebecca's heart, but she calmed down very quickly. She chuckled and said, "What's there to read about this book? The things written in it are all lies. Read it quickly." A few of the kids raised their knives, as if they would be able to stab Rebecca at the very next moment. There seemed to be a slight breeze blowing in the alley. It was the airflow brought about by the reduced force field. Rebecca let out a deep breath, but still took the book and started reading it. This is a letter written to all those who love sword arts, love knights, still have dreams, and are willing to fight for it. The beginning of the story is a place called the School of Sword Arts. Chapter 299. In the School of Sword Arts training grounds, Fang Xinjian sent Kaunitz flying with a single sword strike. The latter's eyes rolled back, and he was so infuriated that he spat out 3 mouthfuls of blood. He fell to the ground and fainted from anger. Slander, all of this is blatant slander. As Rebecca read to this point, her hands were trembling from anger. The more she read, the angrier she got. However, the commoner kids at the side were all agitated. Good fight. Kill this Kaunitz. If I were Fang Xinjian, I'd just take the opportunity to chop off his head. Idiot, Kaunitz is an aristocrat. If he were to be killed, he wouldn't be able to participate in the prefectural selection. Unknowingly, over 10 commoners had gathered around Rebecca, listening to her read and tell the story. Seeing that Rebecca had stopped there, the leader of the kids immediately shouted, "Why did you stop? Tell me what happened next." Rebecca took in a deep breath and continued reading. Fang Xinjian defeated Kaunitz with a single sword attack. In that instant, thunderous cheers broke out, and Vivian's face turned pale. Although Rebecca's face was rigid and she was expressionless throughout the story, as if she was reading a scripture, the story of the commoner young man with extraordinary talent, defeating the evil aristocrat, and moving forward was still very attractive to the commoners. As Rebecca continued to read, more and more people gathered around her. To the commoners who did not have televisions, telephones, or the internet, listening to the story and slowly bringing the protagonist into their own lives was a rare pastime. They clenched their fists tightly because of the first prince's appearance, looked worried because of Charlie's interrogation, and cheered loudly because of the governor's arrival. Charlie cried out, knelt on the ground, hugged Fang Xinjian's thigh, and cried out, "Xinjian, Lord Xinjian, please spare me. It's all the first prince's fault. I was blind, please let me off." As she read these, the fury in Rebecca's heart gradually subsided, leaving behind only a cold smile. To her, the story in this biography was completely illogical and written randomly. How could Charlie possibly be as weak as he was described? However, the many people in the audience all cheered. Awesome! There are too many corrupt officials in the Empire's bureaucracy. This Charlie really deserves to die. Rebecca was no longer angry as she looked at these commoners. She just shook her head at their ignorance. However, this book had been edited by Ferdinand and the others. Be it Fang Xinjian or the other villains, it was more suitable for the people's taste. More and more people gathered here, and Rebecca read faster and faster, wanting to finish reading as soon as possible. However, in the end, fury once again appeared in her eyes. Rebecca let out a cold laugh and said, Fang Xinjian, this be ****, has no sense of superiority or inferiority, and doesn't abide by the rules of morality. It doesn't matter if those Garcia's great warriors have escaped. The right thing to do is to surround Fang Xinjian. Just like that, in order to satisfy their own selfish desires, Kaunitz, Rebecca, and the others disregarded the Empire's safety and let Garcia's destined warrior, Mamukia, escape. Slander, this is blatant slander. Halfway through reading, Rebecca stood up abruptly, her face filled with fury. It was as if she wanted to tear Fang Xinjian into pieces immediately. However, a strong man immediately snatched the book from her and said impatiently, I've long since found an old hag like you reading too slowly. Let me read it instead. Rebecca was so infuriated that she could not react in time. However, she subconsciously held it in. After all, she was not allowed to make a move in the great western city. Moreover, she had held it in for half a year, and holding it in had become an instinct. That strong man did not know that he had just taken a stroll in hell. He picked up the book and continued reading. Rebecca and the others walked toward Fang Xinjian with a smug look on their faces. Fang Xinjian raised his sword and wanted to chase after Mamukia, but he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. He said furiously, Rebecca, the country is in danger. How can you guys let Mamukia escape just because of a little bit of selfishness? Kaunitz laughed out loud. Fang Xinjian, so what if we've let him escape? This day next year will be the anniversary of your death. You'd better worry about yourself. Rebecca laughed and said, Be ****, to think that you'd have such a day. Even if the country and its people are great, they're still not as great as me. Today, I'm going to skin you alive. No one can stop me. Shut up. Rebecca let out an enraged bellow and snatched the book from the man's hands. With the story interrupted just as it was getting exciting, the people at the side immediately started scolding. A few of the Triad members who had been happily listening to the story immediately stood up, wanting to head toward Rebecca and teach this old lady a lesson. A group of people surrounded her, as if they were going to wrap Rebecca up. However, at the next moment, with Rebecca as the center, a surge of power gushed out in all directions. Loud rumbling sounds rang out, followed by a series of sounds of tendons breaking and bones breaking. Then there were countless agonizing cries. The commoners in the surroundings had all been sent flying by Rebecca's reduced force field. With a furious bellow, she had already torn the book into pieces. She had only wanted to buy a book to see if Fang Xinjian had any secrets written in it. However, right now she was enraged. To think that the biography is filled with nonsense and lies, completely slandering me. Fang Xinjian, the two of us are irreconcilable. Knowing that it was impossible for her to stay in the great western city after making a move, she soared up into the air and landed in another small alley, wanting to escape. However, she had not gone more than a few hundred meters when she heard a lady reading. Rebecca stood in the arena, her old face filled with intersecting wrinkles. She pointed at Fang Xinjian and scolded, You little be ****. How dare you try to harm Kaunitz in the arena? Do you still have any respect for the law? Headmaster, this is the prefectural champion that you guys have taught? This little be ****. Green veins popped up on Rebecca's forehead. She took a step forward and dashed out into the darkness, not wanting to hear this voice. However, after she made a few turns, someone else argued, This Kaunitz and Rebecca are really despicable. To think that they would betray the country and even poison Fang Xinjian for a little bit of selfishness. Thankfully, they didn't succeed. Haha, thankfully Kaunitz was slashed to death by Fang Xinjian with a single sword attack, and Rebecca is now on the run. Evil has its retribution. Rebecca stomped on the ground, leaving behind a small pit. Her expression was savage, but she continued to advance, wanting to sneak out. She advanced carefully and finally did not meet with any more accident. Based on her estimations, there should already be knights at the place where she had made her move. It's fine. Even if they find out, they won't know it's me for now. As long as I make good use of the time. Chapter 300. Just then, she saw a few children playing on the streets with wooden blades and swords. One of the children holding onto a sword said, "I'm Fong Xinjian." Another skinny and weak child, as well as a young fatso, said, "I'm Fong Xinjian. I'm Fong Xinjian." "Your countenance." The child holding onto the sword pointed to the skinny boy and young fatso, saying, "You're Rebecca. Beat them up. Beat Countenance to death. Beat Rebecca to death." Looking at this scene, Rebecca was so infuriated that she almost fainted. It could be imagined that as a wanted criminal, it was impossible for Rebecca to retract her confession. Moreover, as Fong Xinjian's book continued to sell, more and more people would read this story. What was even more foreseeable was that as Fong Xinjian's reputation grew, this book would also become more and more famous, and more people would read it. Rebecca and Countenance would probably be cursed for all eternity, going down in infamy for 10,000 years. Fong Xinjian, going down in infamy for 10,000 years. This was something that Rebecca had never thought of before. However, Fong Xinjian might really be able to write her name down in the annals of history. Infamy. This can't be. This definitely can't be. Rebecca clenched her teeth tightly. She was already someone who had one foot in her coffin. However, it was precisely because of this that she could not accept such a thing. Right now, she had temporarily put aside the matter of taking revenge on Fong Xinjian. All she could think of in her mind was how to stop the spread of this book. Therefore, she did not continue to flee outside. Instead, she took the risk and stayed behind. That night, a car belonging to a bookseller slowly drove up to the opposite side of Ferdinand's house. A middle-aged man with a face full of hardships was trembling all over. He spoke with a sobbing tone, "Sir, we've brought the place. It's right here." "Ferdinand stays here?" Rebecca was covered in a black robe, and her countenance was extremely cold as she said, "He's the one who's supplying the goods." Yes. Feeling the pressure on his body getting stronger, the man's heart beat faster and faster. "Sir, I'm just a bookseller. Please let me go. I don't know anything." Booksellers. Rebecca's expression was a little sinister as she said, "You are all helping the wicked. This is tampering with history." Under the pressure of the reduced force field, the middle-aged man's eyes started to roll back, and many marks of strangulation appeared on his neck. His head tilted to one side, and he was strangled to death by Rebecca. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the small villa before her. She had kidnapped a few booksellers before finding this place. Her main motive was to hold Ferdinand hostage and get him to buy back all the books that had not been sold. In her mind, Ferdinand and the others were at most level 19 knights. No matter what, they would not be able to match up to the battle prowess of an experienced level 19 knight like her. Moreover, the fact that she took action should have already been exposed. She did not know if the authorities had discovered that she was the one who took action. She had no more time to waste. "I'll buy back as many as I can. I must make good use of the time, before the books are completely spread out." Just as Rebecca was thinking of this, she had already snuck into the darkness, slowly making her way toward the back door of Ferdinand's building. "Ferdinand, don't blame me. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for standing on the wrong side. You guys want me to bear the infamy of 1,000 years. This is too much." Rebecca put her hand on the handle of the back door. Her reduced force field covered it bit by bit, and then with a little bit of force, she pried open the lock. She slowly opened the door carefully, not daring to make any sound. Her reduced force field encompassed an area of 10 meters around her, freezing everything that she had noticed. This was all so that she would not make any sound. She knew that her abilities were above Ferdinand's, but the other party was not alone. They were all level 19 knights, and once the other party started to flee at full speed, it would be too disadvantageous for her if they were to give chase in the great western city. Therefore, she was extremely careful, taking one step at a time toward the house. Hearing the faint sounds coming from the hall, she slowly got closer to the hall. 5 meters, 4 meters, 3 meters, 2 meters. After turning the last corner, Rebecca dashed out fiercely. The thunder and fire sword cheese in her hands were about to burst out, and her reduced force field was fully encompassed. She had no intention of holding back at all. Other than Ferdinand, she wanted to kill everyone else she met. However, the moment she dashed out, she saw Fang Xinjian, Ferdinand, Anthony, and Robert sitting in the hall. There was also a very, very old man, whose face was filled with wrinkles and looked like a withered tree branch, also sitting in the hall. In the midst of her astonishment, the old man glanced at her and pressed his palm down lightly. Rebecca's entire body was slapped onto the ground like a large pancake. Her muscles and bones were in excruciating pain, and she was like a mosquito frozen in amber, unable to move at all. Head of Department James, who had casually pressed Rebecca onto the ground, smacked his lips and said, "Who is this old lady? She's quite fierce." Rebecca was using all of her strength to struggle crazily. Her expression was savage like that of a ferocious ghost, and she was indeed very fierce. Fang Xinjian threw a glance at her and said casually, "She's just a fugitive. I'll just hand her over to the city guard's institution later." James did not think much of a woman who was at the level of a knight. He let her go and continued the discussion. It's no wonder that you want to challenge the killing techniques palace. Now that you've made a name for yourself, it'll be easy for your book to sell. But looking at the contents of this book isn't sold to experts, Ferdinand said, feeling embarrassed. It's purely for the sake of earning money and selling it to ordinary people. We'll continue to publish books that are meant for knights in the future. James grinned and said, "It won't be a storybook again, right?" Ferdinand also smiled. "It'll be a book that teaches sword arts. But we'll continue to publish storybooks as well. They're selling quite well." James asked nonchalantly, "How much did you sell them for?" All the books he had read before were all boring stories, and to him there was no substance to them. However, there were a few new sword arts that he found to be quite good. Moreover, each book was sold for 50 copper coins. To him, such a cheap thing would not be able to sell for much money. Ferdinand shook his head and said, "We started the publicity a week ago, and up till now we've sold a total of 30,000 books. That's 150 gold. How many days has it only been? It's a pity that pirated versions have started to appear. There are already people in the suburbs who are copying our books and selling them." Head of Department James, can you do something about this? Copying books and selling them? That's right. Those people use the worst quality toilet paper to copy our books. Then we sell them for 50 copper coins while they sell them for 25 copper coins. Basically, half of the market has been snatched up by them. Sir, think about it. There are so many villages near the great western city, as well as several tens of towns. There are millions of people. Even if only 10% of them buy our books, it'll be worth several thousand gold coins. If we were to spread them across the entire country, it'd be worth at least several 100,000 or even millions. James's eyes flickered slightly as he said, "I can only control the area within the Great Western region at most." Ferdinand smiled and said, "That's enough." Chapter 301. Right now, with the Empire's management of books, all martial techniques, especially nurturing techniques, training techniques, amassing techniques, and killing techniques, were under very strict control. Other than schools and factions, anyone who casually disseminated them would be severely punished. For things like Fang Xinjian's biographies and storybooks, there were no related legal provisions at all, nor was there any concept of copyright. Basically, no one would care if one were to casually copy or sell them after buying them. Even head of department James would not be able to create a concept of piracy and set up a copyright law. There would be too many obstacles in the way. Even with his background and reputation, it was impossible for him to do so, and there was no need for it. What he needed to do was to submit Fang Xinjian's secrets to Sword Arts to be included in the category of Sword Arts secret manuals. This would make things easier to handle, and it would be protected like other secret manuals. No one would be able to casually pirate or disseminate it. Of course, with James' reputation, such secret manuals could only be submitted to the Great Western Region's regional government. It would be too difficult and costly to get the central government to approve it. Therefore, James said that he could only control the books within the Great Western Region. James then smiled and said, "If I were to submit secrets to Sword Arts, then as my personal representative, you wouldn't be able to casually sell it either." However, Ferdinand was prepared for this. He smiled and said, "Isn't this what Lord James came here to discuss with me?" Knowing that Fang Xinjian would look for James for help, Ferdinand had already expected this. He continued, "Let us sell our books under the Regional Academy's Sword Arts Department. I can give you 5% of the profits." James' countenance did not change as he said, 20%. Ferdinand smiled and leaned back on the sofa. He looked at Fang Xinjian, who was cultivating with his eyes closed. "Xinjian, how much did you say?" In an instant James' aura weakened. There was no other way. Fang Xinjian was too important to him now. With a genius like Fang Xinjian with such talent and character, there were only two ways he could make him stay. One was to use forceful methods like the first prince, and the other was to try his best to go along with Fang Xinjian's wishes. And Ferdinand had a good grasp of this point. Head of department James glared fiercely at Ferdinand, exhaled, and said, "All right, give me another price. It can't be 5%. If I report this to the department, everyone will gossip." Ferdinand nodded and said, "Then we'll both take a step back. 10%. James still wanted to bargain, but after giving it some thought, he felt that as the governor from 2 generations ago, he should not waste his face on something like this. Therefore, the matter was settled just like that. Ferdinand, Robert, and Anthony would all be listed under the Regional Academy. The secrets to Sword Arts would also be listed under the Regional Academy, and they would be sold as Sword Arts manuals in the Regional Academy. They would also be given 10% of the profits. With the support of the state government, more than 99% of the pirated goods would gradually disappear. James shook his head, looked at Fang Xinjian, and said, "Xinjian, in the future, you should publish fewer of these books. If you want to earn money, you can publish some Sword Arts cultivation teaching materials. With your cultivation, night-level teaching materials will definitely be easy to get." On the ground, Rebecca's body gradually stopped struggling. It was because she had already figured out James' identity from their earlier conversation. The Regional Academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago, the Great Western Region's governor, and a level 29 pinnacle conferred knight. He was not someone she could go up against. What made her feel even more despair and hatred was the other content of their conversation. To think that the book Secrets to Sword Arts would be listed under the Regional Academy. It had suddenly taken on an official status, and it was just like a school's teaching material. How many private knight academies, factions, as well as aristocrats and commoners would buy this book? When people saw that this book was published by the Regional Academy, it was even more impossible for them to doubt its authenticity. Everything in the book would be decided at this moment. Rebecca's name was destined to be recorded in history, and she would be cursed for all eternity. Thinking of this, Rebecca's eyes turned red, and her heartbeat and blood flow sped up. She opened her mouth, wanting to shout out, but James slammed her onto the ground, making her unable to say a word. However, this also made James remember her existence once again. Oh, there's such a person. He casually snapped his fingers, sending out a sound from his reduced force field. Not long later, 2 knights walked in. Take this. Anthony, who was at the side, added, Rebecca, Tresia Clan's Rebecca. He looked at Rebecca with a gaze that was filled with sorrow. Once upon a time, when he was still in Cursed Academy, he had to be very respectful when facing this Tresia Clan's elder, not daring to defy him in the slightest. However, right now, the other party was already groveling before him. Although it was not because of him, it still made him feel very emotional. When James heard Rebecca's name, with a wave of his hand, he grabbed Rebecca across space. His strength attribute was more than 10 times higher than Rebecca's, and even though he was using his reduced force field to grab her across space, Rebecca was unable to move at all. Rebecca still wanted to shout out, but James only used a little force to break her throat, and she could only let out hoarse cries of agony. James was trying to force Rebecca to her death. Although no one would believe Rebecca even if she were to shout out loud, James clearly wanted to resolve this matter in a simpler way. He threw Rebecca a look of slight disdain and said calmly, So you're that Rebecca? Take her away. That look of disdain made Rebecca extremely furious. The 2 knights at the side carried Rebecca away. When they heard Rebecca's name, their gazes toward this old lady were filled with hints of disdain. With that, the matter regarding the books would be settled. There were several tens of millions of people in the Great Western region. With the regional academy's influence, they would be able to sell a huge amount of books and provide Fang Xinjian with a great amount of wealth. However, all of this would still require time. Fang Xinjian and James left this place and headed back to the academy. James said, The matter regarding the books will be settled very soon. After they're registered under the regional academy's name, there won't be many people who would dare to lay their hands on the 3 of them. What are your plans from now on? I want to first cultivate the killing techniques Palace's sword techniques and the 90,000 godly demon flash to perfection. Oh! I wonder if you or Lord Hops would be able to spare some time to spar with me. Compared to cultivating alone, sparring with experts in the sacred land with 100 times the speed was clearly a much faster method. Hearing Fang Xinjian's question, a strange expression appeared on James' face. You're really ambitious to want 2 level 29 experts to spar with you. Chapter 302. Faced with Fang Xinjian's request, head of department James shook his head and said, Hops will definitely not agree. He doesn't even have enough time to study sword art. How can he possibly train with you? Then what about you? There shouldn't be a problem. Oh! James grinned and said, You should know what I want, right? Of course, Fang Xinjian knew what James wanted. The reason why James had been able to guard the Pantheon Monument for decades was because of the profoundness of the Pantheon Monument. Fang Xinjian weighed the pros and cons before saying, I can split the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries into 7 parts and give them to you. With 7 levels of profoundness, there would naturally be 7 versions and a total of 6 evolutions. Fang Xinjian could provide it to Fang Xinjian time and time again, in exchange for Fang Xinjian's help. However, of course, James did not agree to 7 times. He tried to negotiate. 7 times is too much. How about you give me the first 3 levels of profoundness? The first and second levels will definitely be too easy for me. Right now, James was looking at Fang Xinjian with gleaming eyes. In his eyes, Fang Xinjian was like the most delicious cake in the world. Fang Xinjian said directly, Between the heavens and earth, strength rules. Between the heavens and earth, the stars rule. I'll split it into 7 parts. I'll give it to you one by one. If you don't want it, then forget it. James stared at Fang Xinjian hungrily. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheek. The thing he had been pursuing for most of his life was right in front of him, and even he felt a little impatient. He immediately said, All right. 7 times it is then. Tell me quickly, tell me quickly. Therefore, on their way back, Fang Xinjian slowly explained the first level of profoundness of the Pantheon monument to James. When the two of them returned to the academy, James let out a sigh of relief. His entire temperament seemed to have changed. He sighed and said, "Waves, to think that it's waves? To think that the ultimate profoundness of the Pantheon monument is waves. It's a pity." However, he soon shook his head. "If I had gotten my hands on this waves 20 years ago, no, even if I had gotten my hands on it 10 years ago, I would probably have switched to it. However, it's too late now." Fang Xinjian was puzzled. "You said, we won't make it in time?" James smiled and said, "I only have a few years left to live." Although he was talking about a very serious topic, his expression was extremely carefree. "But before I die, I've finally been able to unravel the profoundness of the Pantheon monument. To be able to see a genius like you appear out of nowhere, I can die with no regret." Fang Xinjian asked, "Is there no way for an expert like you to extend his life?" "Life extension? Haha, when you're at level 25 and your ether synchronization rate has reached 60% or above, you'll be able to sense the minute structure of your body and see the little worms that make up your body. At that time, you'll be able to adjust your body's structure. Every level 25 conferred knight will be able to live up to 120 years old, and their physical strength will not deteriorate in the slightest, and they will be immune to all diseases. When you're at level 29 and your ether synchronization rate has reached 100%, you'll be able to sense time and space, truly stopping and slowing down the aging of your body. However, even so, you'll only be able to extend your lifespan to 150 years old. Of course, regardless of whether you're 120 or 150 years old, until the moment before your death, conferred knights won't fall sick, age, and their abilities won't deteriorate. They'll only truly die at the moment of their death." Fang Xinjian's eyes shone with a strange glow, as if he was considering if he could extend his lifespan after reaching level 25 and 29, or if he would still only have 5 years of lifespan after reaching level 29. No, now, he should only have 3.5 years left. He then asked, "Then what about the divine level?" "Divine level? I don't know. It's said that they can live up to 180 or 200 years. James shook his head and said, "They can destroy cities, annihilate countries, and kill up to 10,000 people with a single thought. However, in the end, they won't be able to escape the limitations of their lifespans." Fang Xinjian did not reply to this question, and James did not seem to be willing to continue discussing this heavy topic either. He said directly, "Let's go to your training room and start cultivating now." Both of them were conferred knights who had surpassed the limits of humans, and things like sleep were no longer essential to them. They could cultivate at any time, and there would be no danger even if it was day or night. Therefore, the two of them went to Fang Xinjian's training room. Taking a deep breath and sensing the endless flow of information into his brain, Fang Xinjian felt that his powers seemed to have increased a little. Opposite him, James casually drew out a wooden training sword and asked, "What sword technique are you cultivating now?" 90,000 Godly Demon Flash. Fang Xinjian also drew out a wooden sword and asked, "You know it, right?" James laughed out loud. "There aren't many sword techniques in the regional academy that I don't know." As he spoke, his body swayed slightly, and over 100 silhouettes leaped out from his body. Bringing about strong gales, they turned into a sword formation and dashed out toward Fang Xinjian. On the other side, Fang Xinjian's body trembled slightly, and over 100 godly demon clones also flew out. They pierced forward like a military formation, clashing against James's clones. Thud, 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 thud. Chaotic sounds kept ringing out from the training room. "This can't do. The exchange of ether particles is too slow. You must learn to think from another perspective. Every doppelganger needs to use a different sword art. Don't keep on killing each other. Pay attention to the light and shadows. In the fight between the two of them, James obviously had the upper hand. Regardless of whether it was his ether synchronization rate, his 5 attributes, or the support from his various specialties, all of them made his 90,000 godly demon flash extremely powerful. As the fight continued, James also continued to guide Fang Xinjian. Of course, it was better to have someone guiding him than to work behind closed doors. It was just like how in university, one would either have to learn by themselves or listen to the lectures of the teachers in class. Of course, the efficiency would be higher if one listened to the explanations of the teachers. Learning had always been the easiest, fastest, and most effective way to improve. It was the same for Fang Xinjian when learning sword technique. There were secrets and principles that had been researched by predecessors. Of course, it would be faster for someone to tell him directly than for him to comprehend them himself. It was just that the sword techniques he had learned in the past were too simple, and the teacher's standards were not as high as James. Therefore, Fang Xinjian could just learn them by himself. Right now, under James' guidance, Fang Xinjian felt like a fish in water, and his sword arts level was improving at a rapid rate. However, he did not know that James was even more astonished than him. It was because James realized that none of the problems he had raised were raised a second time. This meant that no matter what flaws he raised, Fang Xinjian would be able to correct them immediately and not make the same mistakes again. Such an effect was great for both parties. Regardless of whether it was the person teaching or the person learning, they could feel the feeling of immediately correcting a mistake or flaw and then improving. This sense of achievement was unparalleled. Therefore, the more James taught, the more excited he became. The two of them taught, practiced, ate, and drank. In the blink of an eye, an entire night passed. Right now, in the training room, several hundred clones were attacking James crazily. Each clone seemed to have a physical form, bringing along light and shadows, bringing about air currents, and even performing various different sword techniques. James's godly demon clones were almost completely suppressed, unable to counterattack. Finally, Fang Xinjian let out a long roar, and another 200 clones split out from his body. A total of several hundred clones almost filled up the entire training room. However, at the next moment they disappeared one by one. In the end, only Fang Xinjian's original body was left standing. His eyes closed tightly as he slowly recalled the feeling from earlier. After a night of hard training, with James' help, his cultivation speed had increased by at least 3 to 4 times. He had directly trained the 90,000 godly demon flash to the maximum level of level 40, and was able to create a total of 501 godly demon clones. Chapter 303. In the following days, Fang Xinjian spent almost all of his time with James, wholeheartedly cultivating his sword art. With James, his best teacher, around him, his sword arts cultivation speed had almost reached the limits of his current state. In fact, if the people in the Great Western region were to find out that James was accompanying Fang Xinjian in his sword arts cultivation every day, 99% or more of them would probably be extremely envious and jealous of him. Right now, Fang Xinjian had the support of the 4 specialties of Genius Sword Arts, Sword Specialist, Unparalleled Sword Intent, and Darkness Sword Sense, as well as the strengthening of the ether particles density by 100 times. There was also Fang Xinjian, who had the world's best sword arts talent, and James, a level 29 conferred knight, the regional academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago, as well as the Great Western region's governor's guidance. Fang Xinjian's sword arts cultivation speed had improved by leaps and bounds. Moreover, he had such an ultimate teacher. He could learn the 90,000 godly demon flash at any time, and he could even consult James on the secrets to synthesizing technique. Of course, there were secrets to synthesizing techniques as well. Apart from the unexpected success rate of ether synchronization, being able to extract the essence of 2 techniques and better control one's thoughts during the synthesis would also slightly increase the success rate. Within a few days, Fang Xinjian had cultivated the 90,000 godly demon flash to the maximum 5 times. He had also synthesized 5 techniques consecutively, and finally succeeded in synthesizing the 90,000 godly demon flash into the luminous heaven soaring slash. In the training room, a light sword condensed in Fang Xinjian's hand. With a slash, a gush of scorching heat gushed forth, and wherever the light sword passed by, the ground would be charred black. Fang Xinjian then clenched his fist slightly, and the light sword turned from white to blue. He slashed out once again, and in that instant, he could feel a gush of cold air gushing forth, freezing the ground into a large area of frost. A satisfied smile broke out on Fang Xinjian's face. Then the light sword in his hand swelled up, as if it had turned into a myriad of light shadows in that instant, encompassing him. James's gaze narrowed as he said, Supreme Mistwind Sword plus Radiant Light Sword Technique plus 90,000 Godly Demon Flash. Is it the Zenith Light Sword formation? Clearly, someone had already researched the synthesis formula for these 3 sets of sword technique. James then said, the clone effect of the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash has been condensed, turning into one sword into many swords. It can now be used to condense sword formations. Try out its prowess. Therefore, the luminous heaven soaring slash turned into the zenith light sword formation, allowing him to perform wave light swords with temperatures ranging from -100 degrees Celsius to -2000 degrees Celsius. He could also condense light swords and set up a light sword formation, increasing Fang Xinjian's abilities once again. Moreover, Fang Xinjian's zenith light sword formation was at level 40. Both the prowess of the wave light swords and the prowess of the sword formation far surpassed that of an ordinary zenith light sword formation. The Fang Xinjian's sword light sword formation was level 40. 2. The sword of the Xinjian's light Xinjian. A. With a single thought from Fang Xinjian, streams of light swords shot out from the light spheres, hitting the ground. In that instant, large areas of charred or frosted ground were formed. Fang Xinjian then put his palms together and clenched his fingers tightly. The light swords shot out from the 6 light spheres instantly merged together, and a light pillar swept out toward the ground. Under the continuous heat, the ground started to melt and crystallize. However, this was just an experiment. The light swords retracted upon contact. Fang Xinjian had already ended the zenith light sword formation. James nodded incessantly and said, the prowess of your zenith light sword formation far surpasses that of your peers. Moreover, these 3 sets of sword techniques are already very powerful synthesis formulas. For the synthesis of the 4th and 5th sword techniques, the known synthesis formulas are getting fewer and fewer. As he spoke, his tone became excited. If you choose sword techniques that have not been synthesized before, you'll be able to discover new formulas. Right now, Fang Xinjian had become a great treasure in James' eyes. After the guidance he had received over the past few days, he had completely understood how terrifying Fang Xinjian's talent was. Like everyone else, he had thought that Fang Xinjian was arrogant and too young when he said that he would become the national champion in a year's time. But now, he felt that it was not impossible. He seemed to be anticipating the astonishment everyone would see when Fang Xinjian participated in the national selection. Hearing James' words, Fang Xinjian shook his head slightly and said, I plan to cultivate the 4 sets of sword techniques from the Killing Techniques Palace and synthesize them. The synthesis formulas for the 4 sets of sword techniques from the Killing Techniques Palace had been researched and explored by several generations of governors. It could be said that they had been thoroughly tempered. After synthesizing the 4 sets of sword techniques, one would be able to obtain an ultimate killing technique. The Prodigious Demolition Sword. It was a set of sword techniques that had been created for the sake of destruction and destruction. Hearing Fang Xinjian's thoughts, James nodded repeatedly. His mind was already spinning. If he were to synthesize the prodigious demolition sword and the zenith light sword formation, no one had figured out what kind of sword technique they would synthesize, right? There were far too many sword techniques and killing techniques in this world. The greater the number of types and the various combinations, there were far too many formulas waiting for people to discover. James started to look forward to the results of the synthesis of the prodigious demolition sword and the zenith light sword formation. His prodigious demolition sword had long since reached the maximum level. However, if he were to cultivate and synthesize the zenith light sword formation to the maximum level, it would probably take him at least 1 to 2 years. During this period of time, he would not have the time to cultivate his original martial technique. There were thousands of such synthesizations, so even he would not be able to explore them one by one. James was secretly excited. If I were to come up with a cultivation method for such a sword technique, it would be sufficient for me to report it to the Central and reach the Knight Association's Sword Arts Shrine. The Sword Arts Shrine was the greatest glory for the Empire's sword arts. Only sword techniques that were deemed to be extremely powerful would be recorded in the Sword Arts Shrine and receive endless glory. It was also a sword technique that the leaders of all influences would fight to purchase. At the thought of this, James found Fang Xinjian to be increasingly pleasing to the eye. At the thought that there might be a sword technique in the Great Western Region's Regional Academy that could be recorded in the Sword Arts Shrine while Fang Xinjian was still alive, he could not hold back his agitation. However, Fang Xinjian suddenly sat down, giving James a fright. "What's wrong with you?" Fang Xinjian said calmly. "The ether synchronization rate has reached 20%. The second stage of the 10 heavenly barriers seems to be coming." Simultaneously, after Fang Xinjian's first month in the Regional Academy had passed, his rebirth sword technique had also been reported to the Central and was preparing to be approved by the Knight Association. At the end of that month, the rebirth sword technique appeared in the Knight's Handbook and was then distributed to the various academies, factions, and departments. However, people's evaluations of the rebirth sword technique were mixed. Potential 5,000. Has this author gone crazy? Has he gone crazy from thinking about money? Nonsense. How could there possibly be such a strong effect? But Hobson was the one who approved it. Tommy, get a new student to cultivate this sword technique. In the academy in Cursed, Headmaster Jackson also flipped open this issue of the Knight's Handbook. He looked at the rebirth sword technique and shook his head. He's in too much of a rush. In his opinion, Fang Xinjian was still in too much of a rush. It had not been long since he became a conferred knight, but he had already created his own nurturing technique. However, after a moment of silence, Jackson still said, "After all, he's someone from our academy. We have to help him. Victor, get a student to try cultivating this rebirth sword technique." Chapter 304. In the training room, Fang Xinjian looked at his stats window. His ether synchronization rate had already reached 20%. James, who was at the side, was shocked when he heard what he said. 20%? Didn't you just transition less than a month ago? How did you improve so quickly? With that, he carried Fang Xinjian and said, "Hang on. You can't clear the 10 heavenly barriers in the sacred land with a density of 100 times. The 10 heavenly barriers referred to the fact that with every 10% increase in ether synchronization rate, one would receive more information. The human body's senses would go through a qualitative change, and when faced with such a change, one would need a strong will and mental strength to overcome it. For such a barrier, the environment was very important. The sacred land with a density of 100 times was usually a sacred land for cultivation, but during the heavenly tribulation, it would become a complete hell. 100 times the amount of information became the best bullet for the 10 heavenly barriers, and it could turn a conferred knight into a fool. Therefore James panicked. Carrying Fang Xinjian, he soared up into the sky, wanting to escape. With a loud boom, the entire house was blasted by his reduced force field, turning into fragments on the ground. And before it completely exploded, James had already soared up into the sky. Fang Xinjian was a genius that would not be seen in 100 years, no, 1,000 years, and he had even solved the mysteries behind the Pantheon monument. Moreover, James had only obtained the first level yesterday. How could he possibly allow Fang Xinjian to fall here? He continued to accelerate, dashing up into the sky like a meteor. I was too careless, too careless. Not only does Fang Xinjian have great sword arts talent, but his ether synchronization rate has also increased so quickly. The success rate of clearing the 10 heavenly barriers in the sacred land is too low. I wonder if Xinjian, just as James was thinking about this, Fang Xinjian's voice rang out, "There's no need to fly anymore. I'm fine." Fine? James looked at Fang Xinjian with wide eyes and asked, "Are you sure you're fine? The 20% heavenly barrier should be an emotional shock, right?" Emotional shock? Fang Xinjian blinked and said, "I seem to be able to see many emotions." "Your nervousness, mine." Fang Xinjian was stunned for a moment, then realized that he had pitifully little emotions. The human brain is also made up of ether particles, and it constantly emits waves. If one can collect the information of the waves, they'll be able to understand a person's emotions. James looked at Fang Xinjian in surprise. You've already cleared this heavenly barrier?" The waves in his heart were far greater than what he had shown. 10 heavenly barriers, 10 heavenly barriers. Just from the name alone, one could tell how terrified the conferred knights were toward the stages of ether synchronization rate. It was because the difficulty was too great. However, right now, Fang Xinjian had actually managed to barge out from the sacred land where the density was 100 times, and he had even passed the heavenly barrier without making a sound. This made Xinjian's James and Saint Xinjian Wang James and James Fang Sun James window. Of course, it was still unrealistic for him to get first place. The competition was too intense, and a year's time was still too short. However, Fang Xinjian kept on looking at James, and then at himself. In his mind's vision, there were more things in the world 10 meters around him. They were some indescribable colors. He couldn't tell what these colors were because they couldn't see light, so naturally, he couldn't tell what color they were. However, through his heaven's perception, Fang Xinjian could see them. He could not tell what their colors were, but he knew what each of them represented. This was fury, and this was nervousness? Was this happiness? He looked at James, at the myriad of emotions, and then turned to look at himself. However, he realized that he was almost completely blank. There were only lumps of fury and vengeance gathered in his heart, as if they were going to explode at any moment. Is this the result of taking away my love, kinship, and friendship? Fury and vengeance. Once they accumulate to a certain extent, they'll need to explode? Fang Xinjian clenched his fists and said, "With a synchronization rate of 20%, I should be able to level up to 21% now, right? Can you provide some ferocious beasts for me to kill?" "Of course, that's not a problem. However, you'll have to take note in the future. The next time your synchronization rate reaches 29%, don't stay in the sacred land to cultivate. It's too risky to cultivate in the sacred land where the density is 100 times higher." Fang Xinjian nodded, but he did not mind it. It was because when he first entered the sacred land where the density was 100 times higher, he had already understood that his brain far surpassed that of ordinary people. Ordinary information impacts would not be able to harm him. Moreover, time was tight for him now. It would be too much of a waste of time to give up on the 100 times higher density and slowly grind away the last 1% synchronization rate. Simultaneously, in the Northern Ice Region's Regional Academy, in the sacred land where the density was 120 times higher, a man with a face full of bushy beard, looking like a savage, was reading a book. Next to him, A student said, "Brother Rellings, the moment you came out from your seclusion, the headmaster handed you the task of reviewing the Knight's Handbook. It seems that he really hopes that you'll stay in the northern ice region and inherit his legacy." The man who was called Rellings shook his head and said with indifference, "Dragons don't coexist with snakes. There's no need for the strong to accommodate the weak. Moreover, when a conferred knight reaches level 25, their body structure is no longer related to that of ordinary people. At level 29, the difference between them and ordinary people is like that of a completely different species. To ordinary people, we're like gods high up in the sky. Gods shouldn't accommodate ordinary people and work hard for the sake of ordinary people's futures. The headmaster still doesn't understand this. That's why he's stopped at level 29. Now that we have the abilities of a god, we must also have the spirit of a god. Only when the spirit and the body are compatible will we be able to strive for the divine level. However, each issue of the Knight's Handbook gathers the most cutting-edge information in the Empire's martial arts. It's really good stuff. There's still 11 more months before the start of the national selection. If I can keep on reading the Knight's Handbook like this, it'll be of great help to me." The other students could only look at Rellings with envious gazes. The Knight's Handbook, published by the association every month, gathered the research results of various geniuses in the Empire. Not everyone had the right to read it. He then said, "I heard that a genius has appeared in the Great Western region recently. He's called Fang Xinjian or something. He's extremely arrogant and brags so much that he's even saying that he'll be able to clear the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Isn't he afraid that he'll bite his own tongue?" Fang Xinjian? Relling seemed to be recalling something and said, "That Fang Xinjian who solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries? That's right, that's him. It's true that the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries are very powerful, but to say that he'll be able to clear the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. I think they're just going easy on him." It was true that there were many knights and conferred knights who had bragged about their abilities in history. To this student, it was the same for Fang Xinjian. However, Rellings shook his head and said, "Hops from the Great Western region is a character. He's very serious when it comes to sword arts research and wouldn't resort to such trickery. Even if he doesn't do it, other people can do it." Rellings did not comment on this, but his gaze, which was looking at the Knight's Handbook, suddenly narrowed as he said, "What a coincidence. This Fang Xinjian's self-created sword technique has been included in this issue of the Knight's Handbook." "It's been included in the Knight's Handbook? What sword technique is it? Let me take a look. It's a nurturing sword technique? It doesn't look like much. Wait a minute." Chapter 305. Under the astonished gazes of the other students, Rellings fell completely silent, looking at the Knight's Handbook in a daze. When the other students saw this scene, they scratched their heads out of curiosity, wanting to snatch the handbook to take a look. However, they did not dare to do so. It was because they knew that every time Rellings entered this state, it meant that he had comprehended something. If they were to disturb him at this moment, they would be chopped up into minced meat. About half an hour later, Rellings lifted his head, let out a deep breath, and said slowly, "Amazing." "Amazing? What's amazing?" "This Fang Xinjian is amazing, very amazing," Rellings said. "This rebirth sword technique is very good and has given me a lot of inspiration. I'm going to go into seclusion. I feel that my saber arts will be able to improve again." "That's right, but brother, you just came out from seclusion." Rellings had already turned to leave. He said calmly, "Get the headmaster to send someone to cultivate this rebirth sword technique. Also, send an invitation letter to the Great Western region and think of a way to invite Fang Xinjian over. I have many things that I wish to communicate with him about." "Huh? The Great Western region is so far away. How could he possibly come over for no reason?" "That's something you guys have to consider. In any case, try your best to invite him over. You can't possibly ask me to go over, right? Within a short half a month, countless influences had been shocked by the rebirth sword technique that Fang Xinjian had written in the Knight's Handbook. However, the results were all mixed. Some people felt that Fang Xinjian was arrogant and ignorant, thinking that 5,000 potential points was nothing to scoff at. Of course, there were also people who supported Fang Xinjian. The evidence for their support was Hop's review, as well as Fang Xinjian's own achievement of breaking through all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. If one wished for others to believe in him, one would need to accumulate experience step by step. If Fang Xinjian had been a nameless person in the past, even if most people saw the rebirth sword technique, they would probably just ignore it and not look at it at all. And now, with the sword arts expert Hops supporting Fang Xinjian, in addition to Fang Xinjian's 2 good results, the current debate had arisen. In order to quell the debate, there had to be someone who had successfully cultivated the rebirth sword technique. It would be best if the person had reached level 10. However, after half a month had passed, there was still no one who had managed to master this complicated sword technique, which was a combination of 100 nurturing technique. This caused the debate to become even more intense. However, these debates did not affect Fang Xinjian. In the past half a month, other than finding time to kill ferocious beasts to level up and go to the sword tower to observe, he spent almost every day and night practicing his sword arts with James. This also allowed him to successfully cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique to the maximum level 40 and the Mountain Shifting sword to the maximum level 7 times consecutively. Finally, he succeeded in combining the 2 sword techniques and obtained the Thunder Prison Earth sword. It was a powerful sword technique that could use electricity to stimulate the geomagnetic forces, turning flat lands into mountains and high mountains into valleys. It was a powerful sword technique that could change the terrain at will. It could even use the earth, which was a great conductor, to guide the power of thunderbolts and silently shock the opponent with electricity. Of course, not only had his sword techniques leveled up, Fang Xinjian's level had also increased. Even the prodigious astral divine powers waves had risen from level 1 to level 2. Therefore, after half a month, Fang Xinjian had risen to level 21. In addition to the continuous tempering of his attributes over the past half a month, his attributes had become: Name Fang Xinjian, age 17, occupation Heavenly Sword, sovereign level 21, strength 103 plus 7, agility 205 plus 7, reaction 100, endurance 76, flexibility 76, ether synchronization rate 24%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 7 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute techniques. Boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, level 40 ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 thunder hell's word earth sword, level 14 aquatic sword formation, level 1 lightless sword specialties. Genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword. Specialist, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, apex, sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense, heavenly sword imprint waves, level 2 prodigious astral divine powers waves, mental cultivation method, level 5 universal sword dominance, lunisolar potential 30,000 point increase / day. Within half a month, Fang Xinjian's strength had officially broken through to 100 point. Due to the upgrade of the prodigious astral divine powers waves, the prowess of the Terra ingurgitation had increased once again, reaching a range of 2 kilometers. The tremendous improvement in his abilities allowed him to perform his sword arts at an increasingly faster speed. This also caused James to feel a little more pressure. Therefore, his cultivation speed became even faster. It could be said that it was a cycle that was getting better and better. On this day, Fang Xinjian was controlling several hundred streams of aquatic sword qis, continuing to perform various sword techniques. The sword qis moved about and the air whistled. It was as if many high-frequency swords were slashing to and fro, trembling the air and releasing thunderous sounds. After cultivating for a while, he heard someone calling from outside. Fang Xinjian's ears twitched slightly and he walked out. In the process of walking, he seemed to be jumping a little, as if he was in a good mood. When he opened the door, he saw Zhou Xingwen, who had previously tried to persuade Fang Xinjian to lend out the sacred land, standing at the door. He was holding onto a food container, grinning as he looked at Fang Xinjian. Xinjian, the newly arrived level 20 lightning fish. The entire fish weighs a total of 15 jin. I've gotten someone to cut it up for you. This was not the first time Zhou Xingwen had come over from the sacred land for the past month. He walked into the room with great familiarity, opened the food container, and placed the plates on the table. TSK, this lightning fish is good stuff. Moreover, it's only the middle of August, which is when the lightning fish are at their most delicious. Moreover, there's still a little electricity in their bodies. When you eat them, there's a numbing sensation that stimulates the tongue. Fang Xinjian sat quietly at the side, but his eyes were fixed on the fish meat on the plate. The fish meat had been cut up according to the different parts. The belly, skin, and gills were all cooked according to different method. Zhou Xingwen picked up a plate and placed it before Fang Xinjian. There was a piece of pink fish meat on it, and he said, "This is the belly of the fish, the fattest and most tender part of the entire lightning fish. A single lightning fish will only have at most 1/10 of this meat. It's best to eat it raw. You'll be able to feel its original tenderness and elasticity." As he spoke, he gulped down his saliva. As this part is the fattest and most tender, there's a high requirement for knife skills. If it's too thin, it won't have any chewiness. If it's too thick, it will feel greasy. I've specially invited a master chef from the regional chief's manor to cook this fish. Fang Xinjian casually grabbed a piece and ate it. In an instant, he could feel the juices of the meat gushing out. The meat was full of elasticity, as if it was jumping on his teeth. Coupled with the faint herbal sauce, the freshness of the fish was ignited. There was also the slight numbing sensation from the electric pulses, which further enhanced the taste of the lightning fish. There's also the belly, neck, and lean meat of the fish. These are all eaten raw. As for the fish's chin and bones, they're all barbecued with a secret sauce. The gills and eyes are cooked into a thick seafood soup. What gradually appeared before Fang Xinjian was an all-fish banquet that used an entire lightning fish as the main ingredient. When he drank the fish soup that was as thick as cream, Fang Xinjian's brows could not help but twitch a little. He looked at the fury and hatred in his chest and realized that they were slowly reducing. He felt assured. As expected, eating delicacies will reduce my hatred and fury a little? It's no wonder that after I entered the regional academy, I've never been enraged by the circulation of my mental cultivation method. Chapter 306. At the same time as he ate the lightning fish, streams of electricity started to flow through Fang Xinjian's nerves incessantly. Zhou Xingwen seemed to have seen Fang Xinjian's nerves tremble a few times after being stimulated by the electricity. He said, "After eating this lightning fish, it can also stimulate the nerves and improve the transmission of information. It can also increase one's reaction quality." After drinking the last mouthful of fish soup, Fang Xinjian smacked his lips and said, "This fish is really not bad." He then lifted his head and threw a glance at Zhou Xingwen, saying, "You've given me quite a lot of good stuff over the past half a month. If you have any requests, feel free to let me know." Zhou Xingwen was not someone who would do anything for no reason. He had been giving food to Fang Xinjian for such a long time, but he had never made any requests. It was just that the more Fang Xinjian ate, the easier it would be for him to make requests. Therefore, when he heard Fang Xinjian's words, Zhou Xingwen felt slightly agitated. However, his expression did not change as he said, "It's nothing. I just know that you like delicacies. Since I'm also quite well versed in this area, I'll bring some for you. Your future is bright. Just don't forget about me." Seeing that Fang Xinjian was still putting on an act, Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "You're not being honest. I do like to eat, but if you continue to not say anything, I can find someone else to buy food for me." Hearing this, Zhou Xingwen immediately said, "Xinjian, don't do this. Look at me. I've trained to be thick-skinned and have a glib tongue. Let me tell you, it's actually nothing much. I just saw that the books that you and Ferdinand published are selling very well." Given Zhou Xingwen's age and abilities, he had long since lost the courage to continue taking risks to strive for higher levels. Instead, he was more interested in things like wealth and power. After all, not everyone, not every conferred knight, would be able to endure loneliness and take the risk of becoming a vegetable or a lunatic in order to increase their abilities. This was especially so for Zhou Xingwen, who had already become a conferred knight. There were far too many things for him to enjoy. With just a wave of his hand, he would be able to summon countless beauties, endless delicacies, and even gold, silver, and jewels. Therefore, he became increasingly lazy to cultivate and instead immersed himself in various worldly pursuits. However, at the same time, he also knew that there were still many people above him who could easily crush him to death. This was why he had opened up a salon, a club, and acted as an intermediary for Westerners. He had even helped Wang Tiangang, who was ranked 9th in the academy. All of these were for the sake of forming a clique and finding a backer. And now, Fang Xinjian had appeared before him. The strength and talent that he had displayed made him feel that he was a rare commodity, which was why he wanted to get close to him. As for how to keep in touch with Fang Xinjian, in his opinion, the only way was to occupy common interests. However, Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "I've left the publishing of the books to Ferdinand. If you have any matters, you can look for him directly. I don't have much energy to spend on business." I know. Zhou Xingwen sat down next to Fang Xinjian and continued, "I'm not talking about the physical book, but the part about the sword technique authorization." Sword technique authorization? You're talking about my rebirth sword technique? Fang Xinjian wiped his mouth with a piece of paper and said, "Although my rebirth sword technique has been listed in the Knight's Handbook, it seems that no one has been able to master it? Do you think so highly of this sword technique?" That's because the person who criticized it was blind. Zhou Xingwen seemed to have forgotten that the first time he had seen this sword technique, he had also been filled with disdain. However, Fang Xinjian had recently consulted Wang Tiangang, who had watched the rebirth sword technique previously. Fang Xinjian was not very clear about the sword technique's principles, but he only knew one thing, and that was that Wang Tiangang had secretly started to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. "I think that in at most half a month's time, there will be someone who will be able to master the rebirth sword technique." Zhou Xingwen smiled and said in an ingratiating manner, "That's why I've come to inform you in advance. I hope that you can hand over the authorization of the rebirth sword technique to me. I guarantee that I'll fight for the greatest benefits for you." The so-called authorization was for Zhou Xingwen to represent Fang Xinjian in discussing the price, duration, and other matters with those academies, factions, military, and other influences. After all, with how busy Fang Xinjian was, how could he possibly have the time to discuss business? One could well imagine how much Zhou Xingwen's status and reputation would increase if he were to be able to represent a sword technique like the rebirth sword technique. In Zhou Xingwen's opinion, this sword technique would be an epoch-making sword technique, one that could even change the form of the entire world. In this aspect, Zhou Xingwen might be able to see further than Hops, who was purely pursuing the Tao. However, Fang Xinjian still shook his head and said, "I've already agreed to hand this over to Ferdinand. His clan has some connections in a few academies." "Then I don't have to do business with the academies," Zhou Xingwen said. "Ferdinand's clan might have some connections in the academies, but they're just a regional clan after all. They probably won't be able to reach out to many other places. For example, the various major factions, the Holy Sea of Truth, the various mountains in the Empire's military, the secret agents, and the Forbidden Army. They probably aren't too familiar with these places, right? However, the Western society behind me and I have a deeper background and will definitely be able to bring you more benefit. Our alliance will be a win-win situation. People in this world would refer to those people who came from the other side of the Western Sea, who had yellow skin and black eyes, as Westerners. Zhou Xingwen and Wang Tiangang were both descendants of Westerners, and the Western society that Zhou Xingwen had established was an organization that was similar to those from the same hometown. It was also the organization that he had invited Fang Xinjian to join in the past. Hearing Zhou Xingwen's suggestion, Fang Xinjian's heart skipped a beat. It might not be a big problem for Ferdinand to negotiate with the academies. However, if he were to negotiate with the other factions, the various armies, and the secret agents, he would not be able to back up his words. After all, Ferdinand's clan was not an aristocratic one to begin with. It would be much better if Zhou Xingwen's Western society could help him deal with these issues. Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "I think that we can give it a try. However, you guys won't have the final say. You can discuss the specifics with Ferdinand. Let me know the results after you're done." Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, Zhou Xingwen's spirits were lifted. He nodded toward Fang Xinjian and said, "Xinjian, trust me. You definitely won't regret this. The potential influence of our Western society is far from as simple as a school's salon. I'll go look for Ferdinand now." As he spoke, Zhou Xingwen stood up excitedly. Suddenly, he said, "Oh right, Xinjian, what else do you like to eat? I'll get someone to send it over in a few days. It doesn't matter what the ingredients are. As long as it's made from ferocious beasts and tastes good, it'll be fine." Hee, alright then. I'll prepare it for you." With that, Zhou Xingwen smiled mysteriously, opened the door, and left. Not long after he left, James walked in. Chapter 307. The moment James entered, he said, "Why hasn't anyone managed to learn your rebirth sword technique after half a month has passed?" Fang Xinjian said calmly, "This is very normal. Before they prove the authenticity of the rebirth sword technique, they won't send highly talented geniuses to spend time cultivating it. Right now, the ones who are sent to verify the effects are definitely unimportant knight. With their talent, it's normal for them to take 1 or 2 months before they can learn it. My rebirth sword technique is still a little difficult." James shook his head. "You're really not nervous at all. You should know that you're under a lot of attack right now. Many people are calling you a liar." As he spoke, he sniffed and suddenly looked at the grilled fish on the table. "What's this?" "An all-fish banquet made from the lightning fish. There's still some skinny fish and grilled fish made from fish bones left. Do you want some?" James chuckled and sat down. "Although this lightning fish isn't considered expensive, it'll still take some effort to get it. You really have a lot of good stuff." Fang Xinjian smiled and also grabbed a piece of fish to eat. The skinny fish was very compact to begin with, and with the grilled sauce on it, it was a rare delicacy. The fish bones were crispy to begin with, and after being grilled, they had a special charred fragrance. James said as he ate, "You haven't been to the Sword Tower much recently. Speaking of which, there's been a discovery there, but Hops doesn't have the time to study it. Recently, he's been focusing on the revamped aerial battle sword technique. Do you want to go take a look?" Fang Xinjian frowned and asked, "What exactly is it?" Before I master the prodigious demolition sword, I don't want to be distracted by other things. Your progress is already fast enough. It's good to relax a little. Head of Department James continued. Moreover, the item discovered this time is not ordinary. It was salvaged from a sunken ship, and it seems to be an item from ancient times. No one has been able to identify the words in it, but it should contain a set of sword technique. Ancient era? What era is that? Hearing that he could not even recognize the words, Fang Xinjian immediately wanted to reject studying it. He did not have the time to study history. However, James shook his head and said, "Didn't you take your cultural lessons seriously? Do you think I have time?" James pursed his lips and said, "The so-called ancient era is an era that was at least 2,000 years ago. It was an era full of mysteries and questions. Judging from the ruins that had been salvaged and explored, the ancient civilization was not bad. It might even have been stronger than it was now. However, due to a reason that has yet to be discovered, an unknown reason, the ancient era suddenly came to an end. Civilization weakened, and the various races and countries on the continent slowly developed." James sighed. What happened in ancient times is still a mystery even now. However, what is certain is that the martial techniques of that time had been developed to the peak. Thus, excavating the ancient era's remnants and obtaining the ancient era's martial techniques for research is very meaningful. Fang Xinjian had not expected that there would be such an ancient era in Miracle World. He was a little curious about what was going on in the ancient times. So he nodded and said, "Then I'll have to see it." Therefore, after the two of them finished eating the lightning fish, they headed straight for the sword gauntlet. Both of them were superhumans, so how fast could they be? Like a gust of wind, they arrived at the entrance of the sword gauntlet in the blink of an eye. James brought them to the depths of the sword gauntlet. In the center of the densely packed bookshelves, countless staff members were surrounding a metal board that was the height of a human, busying about. It was a crimson-red metal board that looked like it was burning with flames. From afar, there were many words and pictures on the metal board. Around the metal board, groups of staff members were searching for information and measuring parameters. Hop's disciple, Leon, the man who looked like a lion, was standing in the center, giving out instructions calmly. "It's not the language of the previous dynasty. What about the minority races? Have you checked them out? None of them. It's not the language of the North either. It doesn't match the sand countries either. The height and width have not changed, but the temperature has been changing. The highest is 120 degrees Celsius, and the lowest is 30 degrees Celsius. We've studied it based on the pictures. It should be a set of killing sword technique. We've compared it to the size of an ordinary man's finger. The words and pictures on it should have been carved by fingers." With James' arrival, everyone present lowered their heads in acknowledgement and then started to get busy again. Everyone seemed extremely excited, like cats who had smelled something fishy. That was indeed the case. Compared to aimlessly searching for synthesis formulas or extracting cultivation methods from known sword techniques, it was easier to get excited about an ancient sword technique. James walked to the front row, looked at the densely packed words on the metal board that was the height of a human, and asked, "How's the situation?" "We haven't confirmed the source of the words, but we suspect that it has something to do with Westerners. We might need to invite a few Western masters over to assist in the research." Leon threw a slight glance at Fang Xinjian. Previously, he had been the one to check on Fang Xinjian's nurturing sword technique, but now it was his turn to report to Fang Xinjian. He continued, however, "Team Leader Hops doesn't plan on getting involved in this research for now. Therefore, we don't have the funds for it yet. To continue the research and invite other masters. All sorts of investments would require money." James nodded and looked toward Fang Xinjian. However, he discovered that Fang Xinjian had already opened his eyes and was staring at the ancient era's sword technique. Fang Xinjian's eyes were filled with astonishment and curiosity. He nodded to himself, feeling that this project could be handed over to Fang Xinjian to be the leader. However, just as he was about to speak, a burst of laughter rang out. A strange man with sword-like brows, starry eyes, and a head full of white hair walked in. He looked like an old man yet also a young man. The moment he appeared, everyone present became nervous. "Senior James, long time no see." "What senior? The Sword Saint's reputation in the Eastern Sand region is much more resounding than mine." James smiled and introduced to Fang Xinjian. "Xinjian, this is the new sword arts master in our academy. He's Sasa from the Eastern Sand region and is a grandmaster in sword arts. You'll have to learn from him." Sasa shook his head and said, "Before senior, how would I dare to mention anything about being a grandmaster?" He then turned his gaze toward the ancient era's sword technique, and a scorching glow flashed in his eyes. "I have some clues about this sword technique. I've once discovered a similar metal plate in the Eastern Sand region. I'd like to take on this project." A hint of conflict flashed in James' eyes as he looked toward Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian turned a deaf ear to their conversation from the beginning to the end. His attention was completely attracted by the metal plate before him. It was because he realized that he could read the words on it. It was because the words on it were known as Chinese characters in his world. Xian country's titular authority, Special Operations Team Leader Lin Ling's masterpiece. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.